Good evening, and welcome. Come in. Take your time. There's no rush here. None at all. Wherever you are right now, I'm glad you found your way to this quiet little corner of the night. Go ahead and lower the lights if you can. Let the room grow soft and dim around you. Fluff the pillow behind your head, pull the blanket up to your chin, and let your shoulders drop away from your ears. You've been carrying them up there all day. You can put them down now. Get comfortable. Truly comfortable. Find that one position where nothing aches and nothing pulls, where your body finally believes it's allowed to rest. There's nowhere else you need to be for the next little while. Nothing you have to solve. Nothing you have to answer. For the length of this story, the only thing asked of you is to listen and to let your mind wander somewhere far away and long ago. Before we begin, let me ask a small favor, and I promise to ask it gently. If you find this journey soothing tonight, if my voice becomes a pleasant companion as you drift off, it would mean a great deal to me if you'd tap the little like button, and, if you haven't already, subscribe to the channel. It's a quiet way of telling me you'd like more evenings like this one, and it helps these slow, unhurried stories find the other tired souls out there who are looking for exactly this kind of calm. And if a thought stirs while you listen, leave it in the comments. I read them. I like knowing who's out there in the dark with me. And speaking of the comments, I'm always curious about the people gathered here tonight. So if you feel like it, tell me a few things. Tell me the city, the state, the country you're listening from. Tell me roughly what the clock says on your side of the world right now, whether it's late and the house has gone still, or whether it's some other hour entirely, and you've simply stolen a quiet moment for yourself. And tell me how you're spending this time. Whether you're already tucked in for the night, or resting after a long day, or just letting the sound keep you company while your eyes grow heavy. I love imagining all of us scattered across the map, each in our own small pool of lamplight, listening to the same story. There. That's done. Now let the room around you begin to fade. Let the walls soften. Let the sounds of your own century grow quiet and distant. The hum of the appliances, the glow of the screen, all of it drifting away like fog lifting off water. And in its place, let something older begin to take shape. Something cooler, something dimmer. A world lit not by electricity, but by flame. A world that moved at the pace of a horse and a footstep. A world where the morning had a very particular smell, and a very particular sound, and a very particular set of secrets. Because that's where we're going tonight. We're going to slip backward through the years, past the highways and the wires and the glass towers, back into the fog and gaslight of the 19th century. We're going to a great city on the edge of a gray river, in the middle years of the Victorian age, somewhere around the year 1870, and we're going to do something rather unusual. We're going to arrive before the sun does. We're going to be there in the deep blue hour before dawn, and we're going to watch from the very first stirrings how a Victorian gentleman began his day. It sounds simple, doesn't it? A man wakes up. A man gets dressed. A man eats his breakfast. But you'll find, as we go, that almost nothing about a gentleman's morning was simple. Behind that closed bedroom door lay a whole quiet machinery of habit and ritual, of servants moving in the dark, of cold water and hot razors, of a dozen small ceremonies that most people alive today have never even heard of. It was a routine full of things that would astonish you, and a few things that might make you laugh, and one or two things you may never look at the same way again. So come with me. Let's walk into that house together. while it's still dark, while nearly everyone is still asleep, and let's watch the morning begin. The street is silent. Imagine a row of tall townhouses standing shoulder to shoulder along a wide avenue, their pale stone fronts rising 4 and 5 stories into the darkness. It's the hour when the sky is not yet gray, but is no longer black either. A deep, bruised blue that hangs over the chimneys and the rooftops. The gas lamps along the pavement are still lit, each one a small, trembling flame inside its glass box, throwing a soft yellow pool onto the wet stones below. A thin mist moves along the gutters. The air is cold and damp and carries the faint mineral smell of coal smoke and river water, that particular scent of a great city holding its breath before the day begins. Nothing moves. No carriages yet. No footsteps. Only, far off, the slow clop of a single horse pulling a cart of vegetables toward the market, and the distant, muffled cry of a man calling out his wares in a voice worn smooth by 1,000 mornings. Now look up at one of these houses. A handsome one, with black iron railings out front and 3 broad steps leading up to a glossy painted door. Behind that door sleeps a gentleman and his household, and every window is dark. Every window but one. Down at the very bottom of the house, half sunk below the level of the street, there is a small window at ankle height, and through it leaks the faintest orange glow. Someone is awake down there. Someone is always awake down there, long before anyone else. Let's go closer. Let's step down toward that little glow, past the railings, down the narrow area steps to the servants' entrance, and let's peer inside. This is the kitchen, though it's more like a cave, a warm, low-ceilinged room in the basement of the house, with a great black iron range squatting against one wall. And there, kneeling in front of it in the half-dark, is a girl. She can't be more than 14 or 15 years old. She wears a coarse, dark dress and a rough apron, and her hands are already smudged black. Her name doesn't matter to history, but it matters to us tonight, so let's call her Alice. And let's watch her, because Alice is the true beginning of the gentleman's morning, even though he will never once think of her. Alice has been awake since 5:15. She rose in the freezing dark of the attic, in a tiny bare room she shares with the cook, and she came down all these stairs by the light of a single candle stub. Her first job, the first job of the whole house, is the fire. And you have to understand what that meant. There was no switch to flip, no dial to turn. Warmth had to be built by hand, from nothing, every single morning of the year. Watch her work. She rakes out yesterday's cold ashes from the grate, gray and powdery, and sweeps them into a bucket. Her fingers are already stiff with cold. Then she lays the new fire the way she was taught. And there was a proper way, a careful order to it. First the crumpled paper, then the little sticks of kindling, arranged just so like a tiny wooden tent. Then the coal on top, black lumps of it lifted from the scuttle. She strikes a match, and for a moment the whole room jumps with light and shadow, and the smell of sulfur mixes with the smell of coal, and then the flame catches the paper, and the paper catches the kindling, and a small, hungry crackling begins to fill the silence. Feel that first thread of warmth reaching out into the cold room. It's a small thing, a single fire in a single grate. But before this fire is even properly burning, Alice is already up and moving, a cloth in her hand, because now she must black the range itself, rub it with a foul-smelling paste and polish it until the iron gleams. Then she'll carry hot water. Then she'll scrub the front steps on her knees, out in the cold, so they're spotless before the neighbors are awake, because a dirty doorstep was a small shame the whole street could see. It's curious to think about, isn't it? Somewhere above her head, in a soft, warm bed, a gentleman is still deep in sleep, and he will wake in an hour or two to a house that is already warm, already lit, already turning like a well-oiled clock. And he will have no idea, none at all, of the cold, dark hour it took to make that comfort appear. That was the quiet arrangement of the age. Comfort for the few was built on the early rising of the many, and everyone simply understood their place in it, above stairs and below. But let's leave Alice to her fires and her buckets. She has hours of work ahead of her. Let's climb back up, out of the warm, smoky kitchen, up the narrow servants' stairs, into the main body of the house, and let's go find the gentleman himself. The staircase is grand up here. A wide sweep of steps with a polished wooden banister, covered with a runner of thick, patterned carpet held down by gleaming brass rods. The walls are papered in a deep, rich color, dark green or ox-blood red, hard to tell in this light, and hung with heavy framed pictures. The air smells different here than in the kitchen. Up here it smells of beeswax polish and old wood and the faint ghost of last night's cigar. It's the smell of money, quietly kept. Everything is still. A tall clock stands in the hall below, and you can hear it now, its slow, patient tick filling the whole stairwell, marking off the seconds one by one in the darkness. On the landing, the first pale hint of dawn is beginning to press against a tall window, turning the glass from black to the faintest gray. Now come this way, along the landing, to a particular door. And here, let me introduce you to the man of the house. His name is Mr. Edmund Ashcombe, and he is 38 years old. He is not enormously rich, not one of the great lords with a castle in the country, but he is comfortable, solidly and respectably comfortable, which in this age was a very fine thing to be. He's a partner in a firm in the city, something to do with shipping and insurance, the sort of business that a gentleman could be involved in without dirtying his hands. He has a wife and 2 young children asleep in the nursery on the floor above, and this tall, handsome house, and a small staff of servants, and a very particular idea of who he is, and how a man like him ought to live. And how a man like him ought to live began the moment he opened his eyes. But he hasn't opened them yet. Behind that door, in a large bedroom with heavy curtains drawn tight against the night, Mr. Ashcombe is still asleep, and the room is nearly pitch black, and the air is close and still. He will not wake on his own. That is not how it's done. He will be woken at a precise hour by another person, and that other person is already climbing the stairs behind us. Turn and look. Coming up the staircase, moving quietly but without hesitation, is a man of perhaps 45, neatly dressed even at this early hour in dark trousers and a plain dark coat. His hair is combed flat. His face is calm and unreadable. In his hands he carries a large brass can, tall and narrow, with steam curling gently from its spout, and over one arm he has draped a folded towel. This is Mr. Ashcombe's valet. His name is Perkins, and of all the people in this house, Perkins is the one who knows the gentleman's mourning most intimately, because it is Perkins who builds it, piece by piece, every single day. A valet, if the word is strange to you, was a gentleman's personal manservant, not the butler, who ran the whole household of servants, and not the footman, who answered doors and served at table. The valet served one man, and one man only, and he served him in the most personal way imaginable. He was responsible for the gentleman's clothes, his grooming, his linen, his appearance from head to toe. He was, in a sense, the invisible hand that made a gentleman look like a gentleman. And the very first duty of his day was to wake his master, and to begin the long, careful ritual of turning a sleepy, unshaven man into an immaculate figure fit to be seen by the world, Watch him pause outside the door. He shifts the heavy brass can in his hands, listens for a moment, and then gives a soft, discreet knock, just enough to be heard, never enough to startle. And then he opens the door and steps inside. Let's follow him in. The bedroom is dark and warm and smells of sleep. Perkins sets the brass can down carefully on the washstand, and then he crosses to the tall windows and takes hold of the heavy curtains. And in one smooth, practiced motion, he draws them open. The gray light of dawn floods into the room. It isn't bright, not yet, just a cool, pale glow, but after the total darkness, it seems to fill every corner. And in the bed, beneath a mound of blankets and a thick, quilted eiderdown, Mr. Ashcombe stirs. He turns his head. He makes a low sound, half a groan, and pulls the covers higher. For just a moment, he is not a gentleman at all, not a partner in a firm, not a pillar of respectable society. He is simply a warm, sleepy man who does not want to get up, exactly like you, exactly like every human being who has ever lived. "Good morning, sir," says Perkins quietly. 7:30. "It's a fair morning, sir, though there's a bit of fog on the square." And that's it. No shaking, no fuss. The valet has spoken, the curtains are open, and the day has, officially, begun. It's a small thing, being woken by another person at a set hour with a can of hot water already waiting. But think for a moment about what it tells us. This was a world with no alarm clocks in most homes, or at least none that a gentleman would trust with something so important as his morning. Time itself was still a slightly softer thing than it is for us, and yet a gentleman's day was ruled by the clock all the same, only the clock was a human being. Someone else held the hour for him. Someone else carried the warmth. That was one of the deepest luxuries of the age, deeper than any object. It was the luxury of being tended. Now let's watch what happens next, because here is where the routine truly begins. And here is where we come to the first of the morning's real secrets. Mr. Ashcombe pushes back the covers and swings his legs out of bed. He is wearing a long nightshirt, a loose white garment that reaches nearly to his ankles, made of soft flannel for the winter months. On his head, if you can believe it, is a nightcap, a soft, close-fitting cap tied under the chin. It looks comical to our eyes, something out of a children's storybook, but it was entirely practical. Remember, the fire in the bedroom has long since died out overnight, and the room by morning was genuinely cold. That warm cap kept the heat from escaping through the head during the long, dark hours, in an age when a chilly bedroom was simply a fact of life. He sits on the edge of the bed for a moment, his bare feet finding the cold floor. And here Perkins is already moving, sliding a pair of slippers into place, because no gentleman would cross a cold floor barefoot if he could help it. Now, the water. On the washstand sits a wide, shallow basin of porcelain, painted with little blue flowers, and beside it the tall brass can of hot water that Perkins carried up. There is no bathroom, you understand. Not in the way you know one. This house, comfortable as it is, has no room with a great tub and taps of running hot water. That world is only just beginning to arrive, and for most people it is still years away. Water, hot water especially, was a precious thing that had to be heated on the kitchen range far below and carried up flight after flight of stairs by hand, in cans exactly like this one. So the gentleman does not step into a warm bath. Instead, he washes at the stand. Perkins pours the steaming water into the basin, tests it, adds a little cold from a second jug to bring it right, and steps back. Mr. Ashcombe rolls up the sleeves of his nightshirt, bends over the basin, and cups the warm water in his hands and lifts it to his face. Steam rises around him in the cool morning air. He takes a bar of soap, plain and hard, and works it over his hands and face and neck. Feel how different that is from your own morning. No endless rush of hot water. Just one basin, one can, carried up by hand, used carefully because there was no more where that came from, without another long trip down and up the stairs. Water was measured. Water was work. And a man washed the essential parts of himself, the face, the hands, the neck, and made do. But now, for some gentlemen, and Mr. Ashcombe is one of them, comes something that our modern bones almost refuse to imagine: the cold bath. Over in the corner of the room stands a curious object, a low, shallow tub made of tin or zinc, shaped rather like a flattened saucer, perhaps 3 or 4 feet across, with a raised back to lean against. This was called a hip bath, or a sitz bath, and it was one of the great fixtures of the Victorian bedroom. And into this, once or twice or more a week, and in the most disciplined households every single morning, the gentleman lowered himself, and the water he lowered himself into was very often stone cold. There was a whole philosophy behind it. The Victorians, or at least a certain determined breed of them, had convinced themselves that the cold morning bath was one of the great secrets of health and manliness and moral fiber. They believed it hardened the constitution, sharpened the mind, disciplined the body, and drove out all softness and sloth. Doctors wrote about it, schools enforced it, fathers preached it to their sons. To rise and to plunge yourself gasping into cold water while the room was still chilly was seen as the mark of a serious man, a man who mastered himself before he tried to master the world. Now watch Mr. Ashcombe. He is not, if we're honest, a fanatic about it. On the very coldest mornings, Perkins will have taken pity and added a jug of hot to take off the worst of the chill. But even so, he braces himself. He grips the edges. He lowers himself into that shallow tin tub, and the cold water closes around him, and his breath catches sharp in his chest, and every nerve in his body screams awake at once. There is no lingering. He does not soak. He douses himself, sluices the cold water up over his shoulders and chest with a sponge, once, twice, 3 times, and then he is up and out, dripping, his skin tingling and red, reaching for the rough towel that Perkins holds ready. And here is the strangest part. After the shock passes, there comes a glow, a fierce, clean, tingling warmth that spreads across the skin as the body fights back against the cold. And Mr. Ashcombe, toweling himself down hard, feels magnificently, aggressively awake. Whatever fog of sleep he woke with is entirely gone, scrubbed away by the cold. And that, he would tell you, is the whole point. It's curious to sit with that for a moment. We spend so much effort now making our mornings gentle and warm and soft. We reach for comfort the instant we wake. And here was a whole class of men who believed the exact opposite, who believed that a little suffering, freely chosen at dawn, set the tone for a strong and orderly day. Neither of us is entirely right, I suppose, but there's something almost admirable in that old iron discipline, even if very few of us would trade our warm showers to have it. Dry now, and pink from the toweling, Mr. Ashcombe stands in the strengthening gray light, while Perkins hands him a fresh nightshirt or a warm dressing gown to wear for the next stage, because we are nowhere near finished. In fact, we have only just begun. He is clean, but he is not shaved, his hair is not dressed, and he is very far indeed from being properly clothed. Each of those is its own careful ritual, and the next one, the shaving, was for many men the most delicate and dangerous few minutes of the entire day. So let's watch it closely, because there is a great deal to see. Perkins moves to the washstand, and begins to lay out the tools. And what a collection of tools they are. First, a small looking-glass, propped up to catch the best of the morning light from the window. Then a fresh can of hot water, because shaving needed heat. Then a shaving mug, a little pot of hard shaving soap, and a brush. And here you must picture it properly, because the brush was a beautiful and slightly extraordinary thing. It was made of badger hair, soft and dense, set into a handle of bone or ivory or turned wood, and a good one was prized and kept for many years. And then, laid out on a clean folded cloth, the razor itself. Now, I want you to look at this object, really look at it, because if you have only ever known the small, safe razors of today, this will surprise you. This is what they called a cutthroat razor, and the name was not a joke. It was a single long blade of gleaming steel, sharpened to a wicked edge, folded into a handle of horn or tortoise shell. When it was opened, it was essentially a small sword. There was no guard. There was nothing between that razor edge and the soft skin of the throat, but the steadiness of the hand that held it. The safe little razor with its protected blade, the kind you might know, was only just being dreamed of in these years, and would not become common until the century had turned. For Mr. Ashcombe and every gentleman of his time, shaving meant drawing an open blade across your own throat every single morning, half awake, and trusting yourself not to slip. Small wonder that many men didn't trust themselves at all. A great number of gentlemen went to a barber to be shaved, sitting back in a chair and letting a professional do the terrifying work. And a great number more, the wealthiest, had it done by their valet, which is exactly what happens now. Because shaving another man's face with a cutthroat razor took real skill, and a good valet was, among his many talents, a very fine barber. Watch Perkins prepare. First, the razor must be stropped. He takes down a long strip of leather that hangs beside the washstand, a razor strop, and he draws the blade back and forth along it in swift, practiced strokes. Flip and stroke, flip and stroke, the steel whispering against the leather. This does not sharpen the blade so much as align and polish its edge, coaxing it to perfect keenness. He tests it against his thumbnail, feels for the bite of it, and is satisfied. Now the lather. He wets the badger brush in the hot water, swirls it round and round in the shaving mug against the hard soap, and works up a thick, warm foam. The smell of it drifts across the room, clean and faintly perfumed. He paints it onto Mr. Ashcombe's face in slow circular strokes, the soft brush warming the skin, lifting the whiskers, softening them for the blade. Mr. Ashcombe sits very still, his head tipped back, his chin lifted, his throat exposed. He trusts this man completely, and he has to because for the next few minutes his life is quite literally in Perkins's hands. And then, in the gray light of the window, Perkins begins. He holds the skin taut with one hand and lays the blade against the cheek at just the right angle, not too steep, not too flat, and draws it down in a long, smooth stroke. There is a faint, clean rasp as the steel takes the whiskers away, leaving a clean path of bare skin behind. He wipes the blade on a folded cloth. He moves to the next stroke, down the cheek, along the jaw, and then the truly dangerous ground, the throat itself, where he draws the open razor upward against the grain, over the moving pulse in the neck, his hand as steady as stone. Feel the silence in the room during this. Neither man speaks. There is only the tick of the hall clock far below, and the faint rasp of the blade and the small sounds of the cloth. This was a moment of total concentration and total trust, repeated in tens of thousands of houses across the city at exactly this hour. A quiet daily communion between two men, master and servant, blade and throat. And there was one particular feature of the age that made all this even more elaborate, and it was this. The Victorians loved facial hair. They adored it. The beard and the mustache and the great flaring side whiskers were the height of masculine fashion for much of this period. A splendid set of whiskers was seen as a mark of vigor and gravity and manly authority. So the shaving was rarely a simple matter of removing everything. It was a matter of shaping, of leaving the whiskers exactly where fashion and personal pride demanded, and clearing everything else with precision. Mr. Ashcombe, like many men of his standing, wears a full mustache and neatly kept side whiskers that run down in front of his ears, but keeps his cheeks and chin between them clean. So Perkins does not simply mow the face flat. He shaves around the sculpted shapes, guiding the razor with care along the edges of the mustache, trimming and tidying, until the whole arrangement is crisp and clean and exactly as it should be. And when the mustache itself needs it, there was a small pot of mustache wax, scented and stiff, to be worked in with the fingers and twisted so that the ends held their proud upward curl throughout the day. It's a small thing, a man's mustache, but it tells you so much. To grow it, to shape it, to wax it, to devote these careful minutes to it every morning, was to make a statement about who you were, a statement written on the face for all the world to read. We spend a great deal of thought on our appearance too, of course, but there was a formality to it then, a sense that how a man presented his face was a matter of real seriousness, almost of duty. When the shaving is done, Perkins wipes away the last traces of lather with a warm, damp cloth, and then splashes on a little cooling astringent, or perhaps a lightly scented lotion to soothe the freshly scraped skin. Mr. Ashcombe runs a hand over his smooth cheeks and his jaw, checking the work, and gives a small nod. He is, once again, a properly presentable face. But there is more to the head than the face. There is still the mouth and the teeth, and here we come to a corner of the Victorian morning that people today find genuinely surprising. The care of the teeth was taken quite seriously by respectable people of this age, more seriously than you might expect, though the methods were rather different from ours. Mr. Ashcombe does own a toothbrush, and it is a real object, a small handle of bone with bristles set into the head, and those bristles were most often made from the hair of a hog or a horse, stiff and coarse against our imagination, but ordinary to him. He dips it not into paste from a tube, because that convenience lies far in the future, but into a little box or jar of tooth powder. And what was in that powder is the surprising part. It was often a mixture built around chalk, finely ground, to scrub the teeth clean, sometimes with a little charcoal, and flavored with something like powdered orris root or a drop of oil to freshen the breath. Some recipes were harmless enough. Others, in earlier and less careful hands, contained gritty, abrasive things that scrubbed the teeth so hard they wore away the very enamel meant to protect them. People wanted white teeth, and in chasing whiteness they sometimes did real damage. It's a reminder that the desire to look well is very old, and that the pursuit of it has always carried its little risks. Mr. Ashcombe scrubs his teeth with the powder, rinses his mouth from a glass of water, and perhaps swirls a little scented mouthwash. And now his mouth, too, is clean and fresh. The head is nearly done. There remains only the hair, and the hair had its own particular secret, one that has left a strange little fingerprint on the furniture of the age. Perkins takes up a comb and a pair of brushes, and he takes up as well a small bottle of oil. The Victorian gentleman did not wear his hair dry and loose. Fashion called for it to be sleek, smooth, glossy, and firmly controlled, combed close to the head and shining. And to achieve that, men dressed their hair with oils and pomades, greasy scented preparations rubbed thoroughly through the hair to make it lie flat and gleam. The most famous of these was a hair oil that had been popular since well before the Victorian age, but reigned all through it. A heavily scented oil that promised to make the hair thick and glossy and dark. Men slathered it on generously, and here is the strange little consequence. All that oil on all those heads meant that whenever a gentleman leaned his head back against a chair, he left a greasy stain on the fabric behind him. And so the ladies of the house began to protect their good furniture by draping small decorative cloths over the backs of the chairs and sofas, right where a head would rest, cloths that could be washed or replaced when they became soiled with oil. These little cloths, born entirely from the greasy hair of Victorian men, were given a name taken from the most famous brand of that hair oil. They were called antimacassars, and you may well have seen one on an old armchair in a grandmother's parlor, without ever knowing that its whole reason for existing was the shining, oiled head of a man exactly like Mr. Ashcombe. Isn't it wonderful, the way history hides in the smallest objects? A little lace cloth on the back of a chair, and behind it a whole vanished world of scented oil and morning grooming and men who wanted their hair to shine. Perkins works the oil through Mr. Ashcombe's hair, combs it into its proper shape, parts it cleanly, brushes it until it gleams, and steps back to check the result in the glass. The head, at last, is complete. Shaved, washed, groomed, oiled, tidied. It has taken the better part of an hour, and the man is not yet wearing a single proper piece of clothing. He stands there in his dressing gown, immaculate from the neck up, and entirely undressed below, and the second great ritual of the morning is only now about to begin. Because getting dressed for a Victorian gentleman was not the quick and thoughtless thing it is for most of us. It was a slow assembly, layer upon layer, each piece with its own name and its own purpose and its own correct order, and much of it genuinely could not be done without the help of another pair of hands. This is one of the great forgotten truths of the age. A gentleman of standing very often could not fully dress himself, not because he was helpless, but because the clothing itself was built in a way that demanded assistance. And so Perkins now turns from the washstand to the wardrobe, and the long, careful business of dressing begins. Let's watch it piece by piece, because every single layer has a story. It starts, as it must, with the things worn closest to the skin. Perkins brings out clean undergarments, and the first of these is a long undershirt or vest, often of soft wool or cotton, or a blend of the two, worn snug against the body. And here you must remember how cold this world was. There was no central heating, warming the whole house to a uniform comfort. There were only individual fires in individual rooms, and vast drafty spaces in between. Wool worn next to the skin was not a matter of fashion, but of survival. A warm foundation against a climate that reached into every hall and stairwell. Over the top of the drawers and vest, everything else would be built. Then came the drawers, the long underpants of the period, reaching down the leg, tied or buttoned at the waist. Then the socks, or rather the stockings, pulled up the calf and held in place, because elastic as we know it was scarce, by small garters, little straps buckled just below the knee to keep the stockings from sagging down around the ankle throughout the day. Now the shirt, and the shirt of a Victorian gentleman deserves a moment all to itself, because it hides one of the cleverest little secrets of the whole wardrobe. Perkins lifts out a shirt of crisp white linen or fine cotton, and Mr. Ashcombe pulls it on over his head. For many shirts of this time had no full opening down the front, only a slit at the neck, and were put on like a pullover. And when it settles onto his shoulders, you will notice something odd. The shirt has no collar, and it has no cuffs either. The neck ends in a plain band, and the sleeves end in plain bands, with small holes for fastening. The showy white parts, the parts the world would actually see, are missing entirely. This was the great secret of the detachable collar and cuffs, and it was a small revolution in the daily life of respectable men. Here was the problem it solved. A gentleman's shirt was expected to be spotlessly, dazzlingly white, especially around the collar and cuffs where it framed the face and hands. But those very areas were also the ones that got dirtiest fastest, soiled by the oil of the skin, the grime of the city air, the sweat of the neck. To keep a whole shirt perfectly white meant endless laundering, and laundering in this age was brutal, exhausting hand labor. So some clever soul realized that if you made the collar and the cuffs as separate pieces, you could wash and starch and change just those small parts and keep wearing the same shirt body underneath for several days. It was economical. It was practical. It cut the mountain of washing down to a manageable hill. So watch what Perkins does now. He takes up a stiff white collar, starched until it is nearly as hard as cardboard, so rigid it could almost stand on its own, and he fastens it to the neckband of the shirt with small studs, little buttons on posts that pushed through matching holes front and back. It was a fiddly, sometimes maddening business, forcing those studs through the stiff, starched holes, and it was another good reason to have a valet's practiced fingers doing it for you. Then he attaches the cuffs the same way at the wrists, again with studs or links. And here we should pause on that collar, because it was one of the small tyrannies of the age. Starched to the hardness of a board and buttoned tight around the throat, it held a man's chin permanently high, forced his posture straight, and dug into the neck with a stiffness that could rub the skin raw by the end of a long day. Some of the tallest, stiffest collars earned nicknames born of suffering, and there were even grim jokes about men whose starched collars were so rigid and so tight that they seemed to strangle their wearers. But a man endured it, gladly, because a crisp white collar riding high on the throat was the very badge of respectability. It said, without a word, that here was a man who did no rough labor, a man clean and correct, and worthy of respect. Comfort was a small price to pay for that. Feel the discipline of it. Even the neck, even the simple act of turning the head, was governed by the demands of appearance. We think of the Victorians as buttoned up, and they were, quite literally, from the throat down. Now, over the shirt comes the waistcoat. You might call it a vest, that snug, sleeveless garment that buttoned up the front and covered the chest and stomach. It was a central piece of the gentleman's costume, often the one spot where a little personality and color were allowed. A richer fabric, perhaps, a subtle pattern, a set of handsome buttons. And across the front of that waistcoat, from a small pocket, would soon run something very important, a fine chain of gold or silver, and we'll come to what hung on the end of it very shortly. Perkins helps Mr. Ashcombe into the waistcoat and fastens the row of small buttons, adjusting it so it sits smooth and trim. And now, around that stiff high collar, comes the piece that finished the throat, the necktie or the cravat, a length of fine silk that had to be arranged and knotted and shaped with real care. There was a whole art to the tying of a gentleman's neckcloth, endless subtle styles and knots, each one saying something about the man's taste and standing. It was folded, wound, tied, tucked, and smoothed into place, and often held with a small decorative pin. It was the finishing frame of the whole ensemble around the face, and it had to be exactly right. Then the trousers, of a fine dark wool, drawn on and fastened, held up not by a belt, as you might expect, but very often by braces, the straps that ran up over the shoulders and buttoned to the waistband front and back, for the belt was not yet the ruler of the waist that it would later become. The trousers of a well-dressed man were pressed to a crisp line and fell straight to the tops of the boots. And then, over all of it, the coat. The coat a gentleman chose said a great deal about the hour and the occasion. For the daytime, for business, and for morning wear, there was the frock coat, a formal coat that fell to about the knee, close-fitting through the body, dignified and correct. Or there was the morning coat, cut away in front and sloping back toward the tails, easier for riding and movement. Perkins holds the coat open, and Mr. Ashcombe slides his arms into the sleeves, and Perkins settles it onto the shoulders and runs his hands down the back and the sleeves, smoothing away every wrinkle, brushing off any speck of lint or dust with a small clothes brush kept for exactly that purpose. A gentleman's coat was never to show a single hair or fleck. That, too, was the valet's silent responsibility. Last of all, the feet. The boots of a gentleman were things of real quality, made by hand to fit the foot, of good leather, and polished until you could nearly see your face in them. And that polish, that deep mirror shine, was the work of the servants, achieved through long, patient labor with brushes and blacking and a great deal of energetic buffing. Perkins kneels and helps ease the gleaming boots onto his master's feet, and if they lace or button, and many did, with rows of small buttons up the side that required a special little hooked tool to fasten, he does that too. And there, stand back and look. The sleepy, unshaven, night-capped man we met an hour or so ago is gone entirely. In his place stands Mr. Edmund Ashcombe, gentleman, complete from his gleaming boots to his oiled and shining hair, wrapped in layer upon careful layer of linen and wool and silk, his collar high, his coat smooth, his whiskers crisp, his whole person clean and correct, and ready to be seen by the world. It has taken time, and hot water carried up from the basement, and the skilled hands of another man, and a dozen small rituals stacked one upon the next. This was the true meaning of being a gentleman in the morning. It was not something you simply were. It was something that was carefully, daily made. And now, before he leaves the room, comes one small gesture that I have always found strangely touching. Mr. Ashcombe reaches to the top of the chest of drawers, where a small object has been waiting, and he takes up his pocket watch. It is a beautiful thing. A smooth disk of gold, warm and heavy in the palm, its lid springing open at the press of a thumb to show a white enamel face and slender black hands. He winds it, a few careful turns of the little stem, feeling the tiny resistance of the spring. He glances at the time, and then he slips it into the small pocket of his waistcoat and runs the fine chain across to fasten on the other side, so that it lies safe against his chest, close to the heart, always within reach. Think about what that watch meant. In a world with no phone in the pocket, no clock on every wall and screen, a man's own personal timepiece was a genuine treasure, often the finest object he owned, sometimes engraved, sometimes passed from father to son. To carry the time upon your body, to draw it out and consult it with that small ceremonious click of the lid, was itself a mark of a certain kind of man, a man whose time mattered, a man with places to be and appointments to keep. That small daily act of winding the watch and settling it into the waistcoat was, in its quiet way, the moment a gentleman took hold of his day. He is dressed, he is groomed, he is armed with the time, and now, at last, he opens the bedroom door and steps out onto the landing, and the private half of his morning is over. From here on, he moves through the public rooms of the house, and the rest of the family and the day itself comes into view. But the morning is not done with us yet. Far from it. Because downstairs, two of the most revealing rituals of the Victorian day are waiting. And the first of them was not about the body at all, but about the soul. Let's follow him down the grand staircase into the strengthening light of full morning. The house has changed since we crept through it in the dark. It is awake now, warm now, alive with quiet purpose. As we descend, a housemaid, perhaps Alice herself, hours into her long day, presses herself back against the wall and lowers her eyes as the master passes, becoming as small and invisible as she can, for there were strict unspoken rules about how the servants and the family moved around one another, and a good servant learned to seem almost to vanish when the family was near. At the foot of the stairs, the hall clock ticks on, and the smell of breakfast is beginning to drift up from below. But Mr. Ashcombe does not go straight to it. First, in many households like this one, the whole house gathered for morning prayers. Come into the dining room or the morning room, wherever the family kept this custom, and watch it unfold, because it is one of the most vivid pictures of the age. The gentleman stands or sits at the head of the room. His wife is there now, and the children have been brought down from the nursery, scrubbed and neat and sleepy. And then, in a moment that would seem astonishing to us today, the servants file in. All of them. The cook, the housemaids, the footman, the valet, everyone who kept the great machine of the house running, come up from below and take their places, standing respectfully at the lower end of the room, hands folded. For a few minutes, the whole household, from the master to the lowest scullery maid, was gathered together in one room. And then the gentleman, as the head of the family, reads aloud. A passage from the Bible, perhaps, and then a prayer, and the family and servants might join in the responses, or in the Lord's Prayer, all their voices together in the quiet morning room. It was called family worship, or household prayers, and for a great many respectable Victorian families, it was as fixed a part of the morning as breakfast itself. Sit with the strangeness and the beauty of that scene for a moment. Religion sat at the very center of respectable Victorian life in a way that can be genuinely hard for us to picture now. And this daily gathering did two things at once. On the surface, it was an act of shared faith, a moment of devotion to begin the day under the eye of God. But underneath, it was also a quiet statement of order, of the shape of the household itself. Everyone in their place, the master leading, the family beside him, the servants below, all bound together in one household under one roof and one faith. It was comforting, perhaps, and it was also a daily reminder to everyone of exactly where they stood. And then it was over. The servants filed back out and down to their work. The children were taken back upstairs or settled for their own breakfast. And Mr. Ashcombe turned at last to the meal that was waiting. And here we arrive at what may be the most gloriously excessive part of the entire Victorian morning. The breakfast. Because if there is one thing the well-off Victorians did with real magnificence, it was breakfast. Step over to the sideboard. It is a long, heavy piece of furniture standing against the wall of the dining room, and its top is crowded with covered dishes, and beneath each cover something is being kept warm over a little spirit flame or a bed of hot water. This was the breakfast of a comfortable household, and it was not a quick affair of toast eaten standing up. It was a proper spread, laid out to be grazed from at leisure. Let's lift the lids and see what a gentleman might find waiting on a morning like this. Here, under the first cover, are eggs, cooked several ways, boiled and fried, and perhaps coddled soft in little cups. Beside them, bacon and thick slices of ham, and sausages. Here is a dish of kidneys, cooked in a rich sauce, a great favorite of the age that has largely vanished from our tables. And here, on its own plate, is one of the most beloved and characteristic of all Victorian breakfast dishes, the kipper. A herring split open and smoked and grilled, its strong, salty smell filling the room. There might be a whole cold joint of meat standing ready to be carved, a pie, a dish of buttered fish. There is toast, rack after rack of it, crisp and cool the way the English liked it. There is fresh bread and butter, and above all there is marmalade, that bitter-sweet orange preserve that the Victorians adored, and that became forever linked with the English breakfast table. And to drink, tea, of course, strong and hot, poured from a heavy pot, or coffee for those who preferred it, and often both were on offer. It is, by our standards, an enormous amount of food for the beginning of the day. A little astonishing, really. But you have to remember two things about it. First, this was, for a comfortable family, the meal at which they could most freely enjoy their prosperity, spread out and abundant and warm. And second, the shape of the day was different. The gentleman might not sit down to a proper large meal again until dinner, many hours away in the evening, with only a light luncheon in between. So the great breakfast had to carry a man a long way. He filled his plate from the sideboard, he sat, and he ate slowly, unhurried, at his ease. And as he ate, there was one more essential companion at the table. The newspaper. Watch how it was done. The morning paper was brought to him, freshly ironed, believe it or not, because in some careful households a servant would press the newspaper flat with a hot iron before it reached the master, both to dry the fresh ink so it would not smudge his fingers, and to make the pages crisp and pleasant to handle. He unfolds it, this great gray sheet of tightly printed columns, and props it up, and disappears behind it. And there he stays, reading the news of the city and the empire and the wider world while he works through his breakfast. There is something in that image that feels almost familiar, isn't there? A person at the breakfast table, half hidden behind a screen of news, reading about the great events of the day while they eat. We do very much the same thing now, only our newspaper glows and fits in the palm of the hand. But the essential human gesture, the wish to reach out first thing in the morning and take in the state of the world, to know what happened while we slept, that is exactly the same. Some things about being human simply do not change, no matter how the centuries turn the machinery around us. He reads, he eats. The tea grows cold in the pot and is refreshed. The morning light strengthens in the tall windows, and bit by bit, the great slow ceremony of the morning draws toward its close, because now the day proper, the working day, begins to call. Let's linger a little at that breakfast table, though, before he rises and goes, because there is more happening in this warm, bright room than eating alone, and it is one of the gentler scenes of the whole morning. Sit with him a while. Feel the warmth of the fire at your back, and the pale morning light falling through the tall windows onto the white cloth, onto the gleam of the silver, onto the curl of steam rising from the teapot. There is a particular peace to a breakfast room in the late morning, the urgent labor of the household mostly done, the day not yet fully begun. A soft, suspended hour of warmth and food and quiet. The tall clock ticks somewhere in the hall. A coal shifts and settles in the grate with a small sound. The tea is hot and strong and a little bitter, and the taste of it, with its splash of fresh milk, spreads warmth through the chest on the cool morning. The toast is crisp and cool and spread with good butter and that bitter-sweet orange marmalade, sharp and sweet at once upon the tongue. There is real comfort in it, a plain animal comfort of warmth and food and rest. The same comfort we still feel over a good slow breakfast on a morning when nothing is pressing. He is not entirely alone either. Across the table, or entering now in her own morning dress, is his wife, and between them passes the quiet, ordinary conversation of two people who have shared a great many mornings just like this one. Nothing dramatic. Small things. A remark about the weather and the lifting of the fog. A word about the children, about the day's plans, about who is expected to call and who must be visited, about some small matter of the household, the comfortable low murmur of a long marriage carried on over the teacups. The kind of talk that seems like nothing at all and is in truth the very fabric of a shared life, woven a morning at a time. There is a whole world of understanding in it, of habit and affection worn smooth by the years, the way each knows the other's small ways at the breakfast table, who takes sugar and who does not, who reads the paper and who talks, the tiny fixed rituals of two people who have breakfasted together 10,000 times. And into this quiet scene, at some point, comes one of the small events of the morning that we would recognize at once, for we do the very same thing still, only faster. The post arrives. The servant brings in the morning's letters upon a small tray, a little stack of them, and sets them down. And watch how the room stirs at their coming, for letters were the great connection to the wider world, and everyone was a small mystery until opened. There might be a note from a friend, an invitation, a bill from a tradesman, a letter from a relative in the country, a matter of business. He takes up his little penknife and slits each one open along the fold, unfolds the paper, and reads, and the expression on his face shifts with the news of each, and now and then he passes one across to his wife, or reads a line of it aloud, and they share the small events of their circle over the last of the tea and toast. The reaching out first thing in the morning to see what has come, to learn what the world has sent us while we slept. The little rush of the arriving message. It is one of the oldest and most human of pleasures. And there he sits, doing exactly what we do, only with paper and ink and a penknife instead of a glowing screen. There were, too, 100 small unspoken rules governing even this warm and homely scene, for manners reached everywhere in that world, even to the breakfast table of one's own family, how one held the cutlery, how one buttered the bread, how one drank the tea. All of it was governed by a code learned so young and so deeply that it had become entirely unconscious, second nature, invisible. To eat correctly, gracefully, quietly, without haste or greed or noise, was simply part of being a well-bred person, as natural as breathing, and a lapse in it would have been noticed at once, even here, even in private, for good manners were held to be not a performance for company, but a settled habit of the self, kept even when no one was watching. There is something in that we have largely let go. That idea of manners as a constant inner discipline rather than an occasional outward show, and something perhaps a little admirable in it for all its stiffness. This notion that how one behaves in the smallest private moment is a true measure of the person one is. So the breakfast unwinds slowly, the tea refreshed, the letters read, the quiet talk drifting on, the morning light strengthening in the windows as the last of the fog burns away outside. There is no rush. This too is a kind of luxury, perhaps the deepest of all, the luxury of an unhurried morning meal, a slow, warm hour with food and family and the day's first news, before the world's demands begin to pull. We so rarely allow ourselves such a morning now, gulping our breakfast, standing up, or skipping it entirely, already half gone into the day's rush before we have fully woken. There is something worth remembering in that slow Victorian breakfast, in the simple grace of sitting and eating warm food slowly and talking quietly with those we love, and letting the morning be a morning before it becomes a race. Not everything they did is worth keeping, but that perhaps is. At last, though the meal is truly done, the final cup is drained, the letters are gathered up, some to be answered, some set aside, and the day, the real day, begins at last to make its claim. He folds his napkin, rises from the table, and it is time to see to that small stack of correspondence that cannot wait, and then to make ready to leave. For after breakfast, and after perhaps a few minutes attending to letters at his writing desk, for the morning post brought a flood of correspondence, and a gentleman was expected to keep up a steady stream of replies in his own careful hand, Mr. Ashcombe would prepare to go out into the world. He would leave the private kingdom of his home, dressed and armored and fortified, and step out into the great roaring city to do whatever it was that gentlemen did with their days. But before he goes, there was often one last small pleasure, and it is a fitting note to end on, because it captures so much of the spirit of the age, the constitutional, the morning walk. Many a gentleman, before settling to the business of the day, liked to take a brisk walk, a turn around the square or through the nearby park, in the fresh morning air. It was called a constitutional, from the belief that it was good for the constitution, good for the health, good for clearing the head and settling the stomach after that mighty breakfast. And so Perkins would bring the finishing touches, the hat, tall and black and brushed to a sheen, the gloves of soft leather or kid, the walking stick or cane, and the overcoat if the morning was cool. Watch the final assembly. The hat set just so upon the oiled and shining hair, the gloves drawn on, finger by finger, the cane taken up in hand, less a tool for walking than a mark of a gentleman, something to swing and to gesture with and to hold. And then, at last, fully and completely made, Mr. Ashcombe steps to the front door, which a footman opens before him, and out onto the top of those 3 broad steps that Alice scrubbed on her knees in the freezing dark so many hours ago. He pauses there for a moment. The fog has lifted. The morning is bright and busy now. Carriages roll past on the street below, and other gentlemen, dressed almost exactly as he is, are stepping out of almost identical doors all along the avenue, each one the product of an almost identical morning, each one groomed and dressed and fed and fortified by his own quiet household machinery. He draws a breath of the cool air, settles his hat, tucks the cane under his arm, and descends the steps to begin his day. But before we turn back to the house and all its hidden workings, let's do something gentler first. Let's simply walk with him a while. Let's follow the gentleman out into the morning at his own unhurried pace, and let the waking city unfold slowly around us, because there is no better way to feel a time and a place than to move through it on foot, in no hurry at all, with all your senses open. So fall into step beside him there on the pavement. Feel the cold of the morning on your face, that damp gray coolness that has not yet warmed. The air is thick with the last of the fog, a soft pearl gray veil that softens every edge and swallows every distance, so that the far end of the street simply dissolves into a pale nothing, and the houses across the way stand dim and ghostly behind it. The fog carries its flavor on the tongue, faintly bitter, faintly smoky, the taste of a city breathing out its coal smoke into the still morning air. Everything is hushed by it, sounds and shapes alike, wrapped in that gentle muffling gray. Beneath your feet, the pavement is damp, the great flat paving stones dark with the morning's moisture, and here and there a puddle catches the pale light. Feel the firmness of the stone through the soles of the boots, the small, even rhythm of walking, unhurried, one step and then the next. There is time this morning. There is always, in that world, a little more time than we allow ourselves now. A gentleman on his constitutional did not stride and rush. He walked to feel the walking, to fill his lungs, to let his thoughts settle. And so we walk that way too, slow and easy, letting the street reveal itself to us, stone by stone out of the fog. The row of tall houses rises on either side, their pale stone fronts and their glossy painted doors and their black iron railings. One much like the next, a long, dignified terrace curving gently away into the mist. Behind those doors, all along the street, other mornings exactly like the one we have watched are drawing to their close, other gentlemen finishing their breakfasts, other servants clearing away, other fires burning warm in other grates. And here and there, as we walk, one of those glossy doors opens, and another figure steps out into the morning, hatted and coated and gloved, pausing on his own top step to settle his hat and take his breath of the cool air, before descending to begin his own walk or his own journey into the day. You might nod to one another, gentleman to gentleman, or touch a hand to the brim of the hat, that small, silent courtesy of the street, and pass on, each into his own morning. At the corner, the ground opens a little, and here is one of the loveliest features of a good neighborhood in that city, a garden square. A quiet green enclosure at the heart of the terrace, ringed by its own iron railings, planted with trees and shrubs and gravel paths, kept locked, its key held only by the residents of the surrounding houses. Even now, in the fog, you can see the dim shapes of the bare or leafy trees within, dark and dripping, and smell the wet earth and green growing things. A small breath of the countryside held safe in the middle of the stone city. The plane trees, with their patchy pale bark, rise up out of the mist, their branches lost above in the gray. Perhaps a blackbird sings somewhere among them, a clear liquid run of notes in the muffled morning, one of the few sounds that the fog does not entirely swallow. Walk on, past the square, and the city begins, slowly, to wake more fully around you. The fog is thinning now, ever so gradually, as the strengthening sun works at it from above, and shapes that were mere ghosts a moment ago begin to gather form and color. The clop of hooves grows nearer, and out of the mist comes a horse and cart, the horse's breath steaming, its great hooves ringing on the stone. The driver hunched on his seat with his collar turned up against the chill, and it passes and fades again into the gray behind you. A hansom cab clips by, quick and light on its two high wheels, the horse trotting smartly, the driver perched up behind, looking down for a fare, and finding none in you, moves on. The sounds are all around now, the ring and clatter of iron on stone, the creak of wheels, the calls of the early tradesmen, the whole slow gathering music of a great city coming to life for another day. And the smells shift as you walk, one giving way to the next. The coal smoke, always the coal smoke, threading through everything. Then, passing a corner, the warm, good smell of fresh bread from a baker's drifting out to meet you and making the mouth water even after so large a breakfast. Then the sharper animal smell of horses and their leavings, and then, from somewhere, the smell of roasting coffee, and then wet stone and wet earth again, and then the coal smoke once more. A whole shifting tapestry of scent, layered and living, the smell of a real place at a real hour, so much richer and stranger than the scrubbed and scentless air we mostly move through now. The street opens wider now, into a greater thoroughfare, and here the traffic is thicker, the movement busier. A great omnibus rumbles past, that lumbering box on wheels drawn by its team of straining horses, packed with passengers, some crammed inside on the facing benches, some perched up top in the open air, clinging on as the whole heavy thing sways and rolls along. The people on top look down at the street going by, wrapped against the cold, off to their work in the offices and shops and warehouses of the city. For not everyone abroad this morning is a gentleman of leisure. The streets are filling now with clerks and shopmen and workers of every kind, hurrying where our gentleman ambles, their faces set toward the long day's labor ahead, the whole vast working machinery of the city flowing into motion around his single unhurried figure. And now, ahead, the buildings fall away, and a great openness appears, and here is the goal of the morning walk. The park, one of those enormous green spaces that the city, for all its stone and smoke, had kept at its heart. A vast expanse of grass and trees and water and broad walks, a lung for the whole breathing city, a place to escape, for an hour, the press and clamor of the streets. Pass through the gates and feel the change at once. The hard stone gives way beneath your boots to gravel, and then, off the path, to soft, damp grass. The air is cleaner here, or seems so, cooler and greener, washed of some of the smoke. The last of the fog lies low over the grass in the hollows, but above it the sky is beginning to show. A pale, washed blue with the sun, a soft, bright disk burning through the thinning gray. The great trees rise all around, their tops emerging now from the mist, and the whole park spreads out before you, dim and lovely and enormous, a green world set down in the middle of the gray one. Walk along the broad path. Here and there others are abroad in the park at this early hour, each on their own morning errand. There, a nursemaid in her uniform pushes a great high-wheeled perambulator along the path, a baby bundled within against the cold, taking the young child of some family for its morning air, exactly as she does every day, whatever the weather. There, an elderly gentleman walks slowly with his stick, taking his own constitutional, nodding gravely as he passes. There, a servant exercises a small dog upon the grass. The park in the early morning belonged to these quiet figures, the walkers and the nurses and the servants and the dogs, before the fashionable crowds of the later day arrived. And then you come to it, one of the great sights of the morning park, the long track set aside for riding, where those who kept horses came to ride in the fresh morning air. Come and lean a moment on the rail and watch. Along the wide sandy track, horses and their riders move, some at a gentle walk, some at a spirited trot, and now and then one breaks into a canter, hooves drumming softly on the sand, the rider rising and falling in the saddle with easy, practiced grace. Here comes a gentleman on a fine, tall horse, sitting very straight, immaculate in his riding dress, tipping his hat as he passes a lady who rides side saddle in her long, flowing habit, her horse stepping high and proud, a groom following a discreet distance behind. The horse's breath steams in the cold morning air. Their coats gleam, brushed to a shine like the gentleman's own boots. The soft thud of the hooves on the sand, the creak of the leather, the jingle of a bit, the occasional snort of a horse, all of it rises gently in the quiet morning. It is a beautiful thing to watch, this slow parade of horses and riders in the misty park, a scene of grace and leisure and quiet display. For the morning ride was as much about being seen and about seeing as it was about the exercise. Here, the fashionable and the comfortable came to show themselves, to greet their acquaintance, to notice who was riding with whom, all of it conducted with the same elaborate, unspoken courtesy that governed everything in their world. And yet there is real pleasure in it, too, plain and simple, the pleasure of a good horse, and a fresh morning, and the open green space, a pleasure any age would understand. Stand and watch them a while, the horses moving through the thinning fog, and let the peace of it settle into you. As you watch, the sun climbs a little higher, and the last of the fog begins truly to lift, burning away into thin, trailing wisps, and then into nothing. And all at once the park is bright, washed with clear morning light, the wet grass sparkling, the trees standing sharp and green against the pale blue sky, the water of the long, ornamental lake gleaming ahead through the trees. The whole scene, dim and dreamlike a moment ago, snaps into brightness and color, and the morning is fully, gloriously come. On the lake, ducks and other water birds glide upon the bright water, and one takes off with a clatter of wings and a spray of droplets, circling once and settling again. The reflections of the trees lie perfect and still on the surface. A gentle breeze stirs the branches and sends a few last drops of the morning's moisture pattering down onto the path. Find a bench, now, and sit a moment, as a gentleman on his walk might well do, to rest and to take in the morning before turning back toward the day's business. Feel the cold of the iron or the wood beneath you, the small ache of the walk in the legs, the good tiredness of it. Watch the light on the water and the slow drift of the birds. Listen to the distant murmur of the city beyond the trees, a low, steady sound like the sea, the sound of 100,000 lives beginning their day, and here, in the green heart of it, this small pocket of peace. Breathe the cool, clean air, so much sweeter here than in the smoky streets. And let your thoughts wander, as his surely do, over the day ahead and the day behind, over the small business of a life, in this quiet, stolen moment between the private morning of the house and the public morning of the world. For this, in the end, was the deep purpose of the constitutional, beneath all the talk of health and fresh air. It was a moment of pause, of transition, a slow green bridge between the two halves of a man's day, the intimate, ordered kingdom of the home behind him, and the busy, demanding world of affairs ahead. On this walk, he was neither fully the private man, nor yet the man of business, but something in between, simply a person moving through a morning, alone with his thoughts and his breath, and the light on the water. We have so few such moments now, so few slow green bridges between the parts of our days, that there is something almost wistful in watching him take his, unhurried, unbothered, with all the time in the world to sit upon a bench and watch the ducks upon the lake before the day claimed him. And then, in his own good time, he rises. He settles his hat, takes up his cane, draws his coat about him against the cool, and turns his steps back toward the gates, back toward the streets, back toward the waiting business of the day. The peace of the park falls away behind him as he goes, the green giving way once more to gray, the soft gravel to hard stone, the bird song to the ring of hooves and the calls of the street. He walks a little more briskly now, his morning ease behind him, his mind turning toward the work ahead. And so, refreshed and composed and ready, he rejoins the great flowing river of the city's morning and lets it carry him away toward whatever the day holds. There we might have followed him further, into the office and the affairs and the crowded hours of the working day. But that is another story. And the morning, our morning, the gentle, unhurried morning we came here to walk through, is drawing gently to its close. He's gone out into his day now, swallowed up by the bright, busy street, one dark figure among many, and it would be easy to close the door behind him and be done. But let's not do that just yet. Let's stay a little longer. Because a morning like his did not float free in the air. It rested on a whole hidden world of other people, other rooms, other labors, most of which he never saw and never thought about at all. And that world is worth wandering through slowly, while the house is still warm and the day is still young. So take my hand, in a manner of speaking, and let's go back inside, back down the stairs, back into the parts of the house a gentleman almost never entered. Come down again, past the grand staircase with its brass rods, down and down to that narrow door at the back of the hall, the one that opens onto the plain, uncarpeted stairs that lead below. This was the border, you understand, an invisible line drawn straight through the middle of the house. Above it, thick carpets, painted walls, warm fires, quiet. Below it, bare boards, scrubbed stone, the clatter of pots, the heat of the range, and the endless, endless work. One house, two entirely different worlds, and most of the people living in each knew astonishingly little about the other. We met Alice at the very start of our morning, kneeling before the cold grate in the dark. But Alice was only one small figure in a whole company of servants, and it's worth taking a moment to understand who they all were, because the smooth and effortless morning we watched upstairs was, in truth, the work of many hands moving in careful order below. At the top of that lower world stood two figures, one for the men and one for the women. On the women's side, the housekeeper, a woman of perhaps 50, grave and capable, with a great ring of keys hanging at her waist. Those keys were the very symbol of her power, for she alone could open the stores, the linen presses, the cupboards where the tea and sugar and preserves were locked away, because such things were valuable and were kept under lock and key even from the other servants. She ruled the female staff, kept the accounts of the household stores, and answered directly to the mistress of the house. On the men's side, in a grand enough household, stood the butler, keeper of the wine and the silver, master of the dining room, the most senior man below stairs. Beneath these two spread the whole hierarchy, as ordered and as jealously observed as any army. There was the cook, a queen in her own hot domain, who might quarrel fiercely with the housekeeper over the boundaries of her kingdom. There was the kitchen maid, and beneath her the scullery maid, the lowest of all, whose whole world was the sink and the greasy pots and the endless scrubbing. A girl very like Alice, perhaps Alice herself, doing the hardest and dirtiest work for the smallest wage. There were housemaids, upper and under, who cleaned and dusted and made the beds and carried the coal and the water through all those upstairs rooms. There was the footman, or two if the family could afford it, tall young men chosen partly for their good looks and their fine calves, shown off in their livery, who answered the door and waited at table and accompanied the mistress on her calls. There was the lady's maid for the mistress, and the valet, our own quiet Perkins, for the master. And in the smallest, hardest, most thankless jobs, the youngest and poorest, the boots boy who cleaned all those gleaming boots, the scullery maid at her sink. Now here is a thing worth sitting with. Do you know how these people were paid, and how they lived, in exchange for making a gentleman's morning appear like magic? The wages were, to our eyes, astonishingly small. A scullery maid, the lowest of the low, might earn something in the neighborhood of £8 or £10 a year, not a week, a year. A housemaid perhaps £12 to £16 a year. a skilled cook a good deal more, perhaps 30 or 40, and a butler at the very top might earn 50 or 60. But even the grandest of these sums was tiny beside the income of the family they served. Along with the wage, though, came board and lodging, which is to say food and a bed. And it was this, as much as the money, that made service worth it for a poor girl from the countryside with no other prospects. A warm attic bed and 3 meals a day, and a roof of solid brick was no small thing at all. It could mean the difference between getting by and going hungry. And the hours were almost beyond our understanding. Alice rose at 5:15, remember, and she would very likely still be working, on and off, until 10 or 11 at night, when the family had finally gone up to bed and the last of the day's tasks were done. 16, 17 hours, 6.5 days a week, with perhaps 1 half-day off, and 1 Sunday afternoon in the month, if she was lucky, to visit her family or simply to sit and do nothing at all. There were rules, too, strict and personal rules that reached deep into her private life. In many houses, a maidservant was forbidden to have what they called followers, which is to say, a young man courting her on pain of losing her place. She could be dismissed for insolence, for breakages, for a follower at the kitchen door, for a dozen small failings, and dismissed without what they called a character, that is, without a letter of reference, which could make it very hard indeed to find another position. Her whole life was bound up in the house and in the goodwill of the family, in a way it can be genuinely hard for us to imagine now. It's a heavy thing to think about, isn't it? That comfortable morning upstairs, the steaming water and the warm room and the great breakfast, all of it rested on the shoulders of a 14-year-old girl who had been on her feet since before dawn for a wage of a few pounds a year. Neither of them was wicked in it. That was simply the shape of the world they had both been born into, and each of them, upstairs and down, had learned their place in it before they could even properly remember learning it. We shouldn't judge them too harshly by the measures of our own time, but we needn't pretend not to see it either. The magic of that morning had a cost, and the cost was paid in the small hours by people whose names history mostly did not bother to write down. Now, how did the two worlds speak to one another across that invisible line? By a small and rather marvelous system that ran all through the house like a nervous system through a body, the bells. Look up, high on the wall of the kitchen or the servants' hall, and you'll see a long row of little bells, each one mounted on a curling spring, and beneath each bell a small label naming a room. The drawing room, the master's bedroom, the dining room, the library, and running from each of those rooms, hidden inside the walls, ran a wire connected to a bell pull, a handle or a cord that a member of the family could tug whenever they wanted something. Pull the cord upstairs, and far below the right bell would jump and quiver and ring, and a servant would glance up, read which bell was still swinging, and hurry off to answer it. It was, in its way, the ancestor of every buzzer and intercom and phone that would ever summon a worker to a task. A family member need never raise their voice, never go looking, never so much as leave their chair. A small pull of a cord, and a human being appeared as if by magic. That was the deep luxury of the age all over again, the luxury of summoning, of having the world arrange itself around your wishes with the tug of a wire. Let's leave the servants' hall now, though, and follow a thread that ran through the whole morning without our quite noticing it. Water. We watched Perkins carry that steaming brass can up flight after flight of stairs, and we watched the gentleman wash from a single basin. But where did that water come from in the first place, and why was it carried by hand at all? Here is the thing our own age has almost entirely forgotten. Water was not simply everywhere, waiting behind a tap. In a house like this one, Water very often came into the building only at certain hours of the day, when the water company sent it flowing through the pipes into a great storage cistern, usually a lead-lined tank up in the attic or down in the basement. It did not arrive hot. It did not arrive on demand. To have hot water anywhere in the house, someone, some servant, had to draw the cold water, carry it to the kitchen range, heat it in kettles and coppers over the fire, and then carry it, heavy and steaming, up all those stairs to wherever it was wanted. Every basin of warm washing water, every hip bath, every pot of tea represented a small journey of labor, a lifting and a carrying and a heating and a carrying again. Think of that the next time you stand in an endless warm shower without a single thought. That flood of instant heat, which we treat as the most ordinary thing in the world, would have seemed to Mr. Ashcombe, and even more to Alice, like something close to a miracle. And water carries us, inevitably, to the subject that every history of daily life must eventually and delicately address, the subject of what happened at the other end. Sanitation. Because a gentleman's morning, like every human being's morning, in every age that has ever been, included at some private moment the most basic needs of the body, and how those needs were met in the Victorian house tells us a great deal about the world. In the bedroom, tucked discreetly out of sight, there stood a chamber pot, a simple vessel of porcelain kept beneath the bed or inside a small cabinet made for the purpose, called a commode, or a night table. During the night, when no one wished to make the long, cold journey through the dark house, this was what was used. And in the morning, one of the least enviable of all the servants' duties was the emptying and scouring of those pots, carried carefully down the back stairs and dealt with out of sight. It was ordinary. It was universal. And it was, for the person who had to do it, deeply unpleasant. And yet no one above stairs gave it a single thought. But this was also an age of great change in exactly this matter, for the water closet, the flushing indoor lavatory, the true ancestor of the one you know, was spreading through the better houses of the city during precisely these years. A comfortable household like Mr. Ashcombe's might well have one, a small closet with a bowl that flushed with water from a cistern above, a genuine marvel of the modern age. But even these were often crude and smelly things by our standards, and the pipes that carried the waste away, and the great question of where all that waste from a vast and growing city actually went, was one of the burning problems of the entire century. For the truth is that the city these people lived in was, for much of this age, a place of appalling smells, and worse than smells. Human waste, and the waste of countless horses, and the filth of 100 trades. All of it too often ended up in the same river that wound through the heart of the city, the very river these fine houses looked out upon. There had been years, not long before our morning, when the stench rising off that river in the summer heat had grown so unbearable that the business of the government itself, sitting in its great halls right beside the water, had nearly ground to a halt, and the curtains had been soaked in chemicals in a desperate attempt to keep the smell at bay. And worse than the smell was the sickness, for again and again the city had been swept by terrible outbreaks of disease that spread through the foul water, killing thousands, until at last a stubborn few came to understand that the sickness and the filthy water were one and the same problem. And so, in these very decades, an enormous work was underway beneath the streets, a vast network of new brick sewers, tunnels large enough to walk through, built to carry the whole city's waste far away downstream. It was one of the greatest feats of building of the entire age, and it was slowly, quietly, saving countless lives, though the fine gentleman stepping out his front door in his gleaming boots very likely gave it not a moment's thought. It's a strange and humbling thing to remember, That beneath the elegance and the ceremony, beneath the starched collars and the badger brushes and the marmalade, this was still a world where the simple matter of clean water and safe waste was a life and death struggle only just being won. We flush and forget. They lived on the very frontier of that comfort, watching it being built, tunnel by brick tunnel beneath their feet. But let's climb back up into the lighter air and turn to something that touched every single garment we watched Perkins lay out this morning. The laundry. Because that dazzling white shirt, that stiff, snowy collar, all of it had to be made white and kept white, and the keeping of it was one of the most brutal labors of the entire household week. Picture, if you will, wash day, which came round once a week and was dreaded by everyone below stairs, for it turned the whole lower house into a hot, steaming, exhausting factory of cloth. There were no machines to do this work. None of the humming boxes we simply load and forget. Every single item, every shirt and sheet and petticoat and tablecloth and towel had to be washed by hand, and the doing of it took the better part of 2 whole days. First the sorting, and then the soaking. Then the great copper, an enormous vessel built over its own fire, filled with water that had to be heated to boiling, into which the whites were plunged and boiled to loosen the dirt. Then the labor of the wash itself, the clothes scrubbed by hand on a ridged washboard or pounded with a wooden implement called a dolly in a great tub, the laundress bent over the water with her arms red and raw and her back aching, her hands wrinkled and sore from the harsh soap and the endless wet. Then rinsing, again and again. Then, for the whites, a curious final touch, a little bag of blue dye swirled through the final rinse, because a faint touch of blue, strange as it sounds, made white cloth look whiter to the eye than plain white ever could. Then the starch, boiled up and applied to the collars and cuffs and shirt fronts, to give them that hard, crisp, glorious stiffness. Then the water wrung out, by hand, or through a great mangle with its heavy rollers turned by a crank, an exhausting effort in itself. Then the drying and the ironing, with heavy flat irons heated on the range, lifted and tested against the cheek for the right heat, and worked back and forth over every inch of every garment until it lay smooth and perfect. 2 days of this, every week, for the linen of a single family. And now, at last, you understand fully why that little Victorian invention we met earlier, the detachable collar and cuffs, was such a small, quiet blessing. When the parts that soiled fastest could be unbuttoned and washed on their own, the mountain of washing shrank, and the poor laundress, bent red-armed over her tub, had a few hundred fewer inches of cloth to scrub. It was not a grand invention. It changed no wars and toppled no thrones. But it made one hard human life a little less hard. And there is a particular kind of history hidden in things like that, the history of small mercies. Now come away from the steam and back up to the calmer rooms, because there is another thread from our morning to follow, one that seems very quiet, but that ran through the whole life of a gentleman like a hidden river. Letters. We watched Mr. Ashcombe pause at his writing desk after breakfast, and it would be easy to skip past that as a small thing. It was not. The writing and receiving of letters was one of the great daily occupations of respectable life, far more so than we might guess, for this was an age with no telephone in the house, no instant message, no other way at all to speak to someone across the city or the country, except to write it down and send it. And send it you could, with a speed that might surprise you. In a great city, the post did not come once a day, as it might for us. It came again and again, several deliveries a day, so that a letter written in the morning might be answered that very afternoon, and a note dashed off could reach a friend across town within hours. In its own way, it was a swift and constant conversation carried on entirely in ink and paper, and a gentleman was expected to keep up his end of it faithfully, replying promptly and in his own careful hand to every letter that came. And alongside the letters ran another small paper ritual, the calling card, which governed the whole strange dance of Victorian social life. A small, stiff rectangle of card, printed simply with a person's name. It was left when one paid a visit to another household. There were elaborate, unwritten rules about all of it, about the hours during which a lady was at home to receive visitors, about leaving a card when the person was out, about the meaning of a corner of the card turned down, about who might call upon whom and when. The whole intricate machinery of who knew whom, who was received, who might be visited, ran on these little cards carried on silver trays by the footman. To us it can seem impossibly fussy, a great fuss made over slips of pasteboard. But it was, in truth, a careful system for managing relationships in a large city among people who cared enormously about exactly who was and was not one of their own kind. It drew the lines of the social world, quietly, on card after little card. And that brings us gently to the great invisible force that shaped almost everything we've seen this morning, the thing that decided who carried the water and who drank the tea, who scrubbed the step, and who read the newspaper. Class. It ran through this world like the grain runs through wood, present in everything, spoken of by almost no one, because it did not need to be spoken of. Everyone simply knew. Everyone knew, from the cut of a coat, and the sound of a voice, and the whiteness of a collar, and the softness of a hand, exactly where a person stood, and behaved accordingly. It was in the way Alice pressed herself to the wall as the master passed. It was in the way the family and the servants gathered in the same room for prayers, and yet stood in two entirely separate groups. It was in the wages and the hours, and the follower's rule and the letter of character. This whole elaborate morning, in a sense, was a daily performance of class, a way for a gentleman to make himself every single day unmistakably and visibly a gentleman, so that the whole world would read it in an instant and treat him as such. Even the clothing said it in a language everyone could read. Consider the hands. A gentleman's hands were soft, pale, and unmarked, and that softness was itself a kind of announcement, for it said that these were hands that did no rough labor, no digging or scrubbing or hauling. The very uselessness of the hands, in a working sense, was the point. And the gloves he drew on before stepping out did the same work, keeping the hands clean and pale and protected, marking him at a glance as a man who worked, if he worked at all, with his mind and his pen, and not his back. Even the tall, stiff collar that half strangled him played its part, for a man could hardly stoop to heavy labor with his neck locked upright in a band of starch. The whole costume was, in a sense, a suit of armor against ever being mistaken for someone who worked with his hands. It's a curious thought that so much discomfort was endured precisely in order to advertise a life of ease, and there were fierce, unspoken rules about what a gentleman wore and when, rules as strict in their way as any law. What he put on this morning, the frock coat, or the morning coat, was daytime dress, correct for business and for the morning hours. He would no more have worn it to a dinner or an evening party than he would have gone out in his nightshirt, for the evening demanded an entirely different and even more formal costume, the black tailcoat and white tie of the dinner table. To wear the wrong thing at the wrong hour was not a small mistake. It marked a man as ignorant, as not quite one of us, as someone who did not truly know the code. And the code was everything. The hat had to be raised in just the right way when greeting a lady in the street. The gloves had to be worn, and worn correctly. There was a right way to carry the cane, a right way to bow, a right way to enter a room. A gentleman had spent his entire life, from the nursery onward, learning these 1,000 small rules until they were as natural to him as breathing, and it was the effortless knowing of them, more than any single piece of clothing, that truly marked him out. Now let's step outside for a while, out through that glossy front door, and into the city that Mr. Ashcombe walked into on his constitutional, because the street was its own world, and it woke in its own way, and it was as full of life and labor as the house behind him. Come out onto the pavement and stand a moment. The fog has thinned, but the air still carries that particular flavor of the city, a mingling of coal smoke and horse and river and cooking and 1,000 other things, sharp in the nose, faintly gritty on the tongue. For everywhere, there was coal. Every house burned it, in grate after grate, and every fire sent its thread of smoke up into the sky, and all those threads together hung a permanent gray-brown haze over the rooftops, so that even a bright morning had a smudged and softened quality, and the fine soot settled, invisibly, on every window ledge and white collar and pale glove in the city. It was the smell of warmth and industry and home, and it was also, though few yet understood it, a slow poison in the lungs of everyone who breathed it. And the sounds. Oh, the sounds of that street. There was no engine's roar, none of the mechanical hum we live inside without hearing. Instead, there was the endless clatter and ring of iron-shod hooves and iron-rimmed wheels on the stone and cobble, for everything moved by horse. Grand private carriages rolled by, and public omnibuses, great boxes on wheels drawn by teams of horses, packed with passengers inside and perched precariously on top. Hansom cabs darted through the traffic, two-wheeled and quick, the driver perched high behind, ready to carry a gentleman anywhere for a fare. And weaving among all of them, on foot, was the whole teeming life of the street's working poor. There, at the corner, stands a ragged boy with a broom. He is a crossing sweeper, and his whole trade, his only living, is to sweep a clean path across the filthy street, through the mud and the horse dung, so that a well-dressed lady or gentleman might cross without soiling their fine boots and hems, and drop him a small coin in thanks. A penny here, a halfpenny there, swept up from the gutter of a great city, and down the street a costermonger pushes his barrow, crying his wares in that same worn, sing-song shout we heard at the very beginning of our morning, selling fruit or fish or vegetables from the barrow to whoever will buy. There are flower girls, and match sellers, and errand boys, and a whole population of people scraping a living out of the cracks and corners of the wealthy city, invisible to most of the gentlemen who stepped over and around them every single day. It's a strange thing to hold both pictures in the mind at once. The immaculate gentleman on his healthful morning walk, swinging his cane, and the barefoot sweeper boy in the gutter beside him, both of them out in the same cold morning, in the same great city, living lives so utterly different they might almost have been in different countries. And yet, there they were, side by side on the same stone. That, too, was the age. Enormous wealth and grinding poverty pressed right up against each other, sharing the same streets, the same fog, the same church bells ringing out the hours over them all. Let's turn now to something warmer, something that sat right there on the breakfast table this morning and that carried, in its own quiet way, the whole reach of an empire. The tea, and the sugar in it, and the marmalade beside it, and the spices in the kitchen, and a dozen other small, ordinary things that Mr. Ashcombe consumed without a thought. Think for a moment about that steaming pot of tea, Where did it come from? Not from any field within 1,000 miles of that dining room. It came from the far side of the world, from vast plantations in distant lands, picked by hands the gentleman would never see, packed and shipped across oceans in the holds of great sailing ships and steamers, to arrive at last, dried and dark, in the locked tea-caddy that the housekeeper guarded with her ring of keys. The sugar he stirred into it came from other distant lands, from plantations with their own long and often terrible histories. The very china cup he drank from had a design born of the trade with the East. This ordinary morning cup of tea was, in truth, a small monument to a web of trade and ships and far-off labor that spanned the entire globe, all of it flowing quietly inward to fill the breakfast cups of comfortable families in a gray northern city. Even the kipper on his plate, that humble smoked herring, spoke of a whole world of work, of fishing fleets putting out in the cold dark before dawn, of the catch landed and gutted and split and smoked over slow fires, of the railways that had lately spread across the whole country like a web of iron, carrying fresh fish inland faster than ever before, so that a man far from any sea could have his morning kipper hot upon his plate. That railway, still new and marvelous in these years, was quietly changing everything about how people ate, drawing fresh food from the far corners of the land into the cities, filling the sideboards of the comfortable with things that a generation before would have spoiled long before they arrived. The gentleman lifting his fork gave none of it a thought, but the whole modern world of trade and steam and speed was there, humming beneath his breakfast, if only he had cared to look, and now a gentler subject, though one the Victorians took with enormous seriousness, the whole matter of health and the strange and often mistaken ideas they held about how to keep it. We saw it already in the cold morning bath, that fierce faith that a plunge into cold water hardened the body and the spirit. But the belief in the healing power of certain habits ran all through the age, and much of it, seen from where we stand, was a curious mixture of sound instinct and complete misunderstanding. They believed deeply, for instance, in the goodness of fresh air, and there was real wisdom in that, given the smoke and filth of the city, and a gentleman's morning walk was partly a dose of medicine, a deliberate filling of the lungs with air a little cleaner than the fug of the house. They believed in regularity, in keeping the body to a fixed and orderly routine, and there was something to that too. But they also believed a great many things that were simply wrong, and sometimes dangerous. The corner chemist's shop was stocked with an astonishing array of tonics and pills and potions, patent medicines with grand promises printed on their labels, cures for every ailment under the sun, and many of these contained substances that we would now be horrified to swallow. Powerful drugs sold freely across the counter to anyone with a coin, taken by respectable people for the smallest complaint. A gentleman might dose himself or his children with preparations that we now know to be poisons in perfect good faith, believing he was tending his health. The line between medicine and harm was blurred and badly drawn, and a great deal of suffering came of it, all of it entered into with the best of intentions. It's a humbling thing to remember that these were not foolish people. They were as intelligent as we are, as careful, as loving of their families. They simply did not know what we now know, and they did the best they could with the understanding they had, exactly as we do, and exactly as those who come after us will one day say of us in their turn. We should be slow to laugh at their cold baths and their poison tonics. They were doing what we all do, feeling their way toward health in a world that had not yet given up all its secrets. And where was Mr. Ashcombe walking on that brisk constitutional as we followed all these threads out from his morning? Very likely, in time, toward the heart of the city and the business of the day. but perhaps before that, or after, toward one particular kind of place that was almost a second home to a gentleman of his sort, the club. The Gentleman's Club was one of the great institutions of this world, a grand and comfortable building, quiet and richly furnished, that existed for one purpose above all, to be a refuge for men of a certain kind. Inside its doors, a member could read the newspapers in a deep leather chair, write his letters, take a meal, meet his friends and his business connections, doze by the fire, and above all, be entirely and comfortably among his own kind, in a world of hushed voices and deferential servants and quiet order. To belong to the right club was itself a mark of a man's standing, for one did not simply pay to enter. One had to be proposed, and seconded, and approved, and a man could be quietly refused or excluded, and the shame of it was real. The club was, in a way, the whole social code of the age made solid, a building whose very walls said who was in and who was out, and for many a gentleman it was the place where he felt most fully himself, most at ease, most surrounded by the invisible rules he had spent his life learning, all of them here made warm and comfortable and lined with good leather and old wood. So there he goes, off toward whatever the day holds, the club and the office and the affairs of a man of business, growing smaller in the fog until he is just one more dark hat and coat among the countless others, indistinguishable now from all the other gentlemen who began their mornings in almost exactly the same way, in almost exactly the same kind of house, tended by almost exactly the same kind of quiet servant, up and down every street of every good neighborhood in the whole great city. Thousands of them, tens of thousands, all rising to the same rituals, the same cold water and hot razors and stiff collars and family prayers and vast breakfasts, all of it repeating behind door after glossy door, morning after morning, year after year, the whole comfortable machinery of a whole comfortable class turning quietly over in the gray northern dawn. And behind every one of those gentlemen, an Alice, a girl kneeling before a cold grate in the dark, building the fire that would warm a room she was barely permitted to enter, for a wage of a few pounds a year, so that a man she would scarcely speak to could wake to comfort, and never once wonder how the comfort came to be. That was the world, both halves of it, the warm and the cold, the served and the serving, bound together in the same tall houses, sharing the same walls and never quite the same lives. But before we step back through that door for the last time, there are still a few quiet corners of this morning we haven't yet visited, and each one has something to tell us. So linger with me just a little longer. The day is still young, after all, and there is no hurry at all. Let's begin with something so simple that we've walked right past it a dozen times already this morning without a second glance. Light. The way this whole world was lit. Because the light of the Victorian house was nothing like the light you are sitting in now, and once you understand it, you understand a great deal about how the morning felt. There was no switch upon the wall. There was no soft, steady, shadowless glow that filled a room evenly at the touch of a finger. Instead, light came from flame, always from flame, in one form or another, and flame is a living, moving, breathing thing. Think back to that first fire Alice built in the dark. Think of the single candle stub that lit her way down the stairs, its small flame swaying with every step, throwing her shadow huge and wavering across the walls. Candles were still everywhere in this world, made of wax or of tallow, the cheaper ones of rendered fat that smoked and smelled, the finer ones of clean burning beeswax, or the newer sort that gave a steadier flame. To carry a candle through a dark house was an ordinary nightly act. the little pool of light traveling with you, the darkness closing in again behind. But a house like Mr. Ashcombe's had something grander and more modern than candles for its main rooms. It had gas, running through pipes in the walls, fed from the great gasworks that stood somewhere on the edge of the city, came a supply of gas that could be lit at little fittings on the walls and ceilings, burning with a flame that gave far more light than any candle. To light it, you turned a small tap and held a match to the burner, and with a soft pop, the flame caught and steadied, casting a warm yellow-white glow over the room. It was a wonder of the age, this gaslight, and it had utterly transformed the evenings of the city, pushing back the dark, lengthening the useful day, lighting the streets and the shops and the homes as never before in all of human history. And yet, and this is worth pausing on, that gaslight was not the clean, cold light we know. It flickered, ever so slightly, always alive, always moving. It gave off a faint but real heat, and a faint but real smell, and it slowly blackened the ceilings above it and dirtied the very air of the room, so that curtains and wallpaper and the lungs of the people beneath all suffered a little from it. And out in the street, at dusk, a man would come walking with a long pole, the lamplighter, touching his flame to each gas lamp in turn, so that one by one down the whole length of the avenue the little lights bloomed in the gathering dark. A sight so ordinary then that no one remarked on it, and so lovely that we can scarcely imagine it now. So picture the quality of it all. A world lit by moving flame, shadows that danced instead of staying still, pools of warm light with soft darkness pressing at their edges, corners of every room that were never quite bright. This was the light our gentleman woke into and dressed by and read his newspaper beneath, and it gave the whole day a texture, a softness, a depth of shadow that our flat and even brightness has entirely lost. There is a particular coziness to a room lit by flame, a gathering-in quality that some part of us still remembers and still longs for, which is perhaps why, even now, we light candles when we want a room to feel warm and safe and old. Now, while the light is on our minds, let's go back up those stairs one more time, very early, earlier than we've yet been, and watch a part of the morning we only glimpsed before, the housemaid's dawn rounds, because before the gentleman ever stirred, before Perkins ever climbed with his brass can, another servant had already moved silently through the upstairs rooms, doing the quiet, invisible work that made the warm morning possible. Watch a housemaid then, not Alice this time, but one of the older girls, moving through the sleeping house in the gray half-light with a heavy box in her hands. In the box are her tools and her materials, the brushes and cloths, the black lead for polishing the grates, the paper and kindling, and a small supply of coal. Her task, in room after room, is the fire. She creeps into a bedroom where the family still sleeps, or into the morning room and the dining room where they soon will sit, and she kneels before the cold, dead grate, and she does the same patient labor we watched Alice do in the kitchen. Rake out yesterday's ashes, clean and black the grate, lay the new fire, paper and kindling and coal in their careful order, and in the rooms that must be warm before the family rises, light it and coax it and leave it burning so that the room will be comfortable by the time anyone opens their eyes. She works quickly and quietly, for she must move through many rooms, and she must be finished and gone, or nearly invisible, before the family begins to stir. She draws back shutters and curtains to let in the growing light. She empties the chamber pots, that least pleasant of duties, carrying them carefully down the back stairs. She sets out fresh water. She tidies what the night has disarranged. All of it done in near silence, All of it done before the world above stairs was even awake to have it done for them. And this is the deep, quiet truth of that comfortable morning, that its comfort was built in the dark, by hands that were meant never to be seen, so that when the family woke, the warmth and the light and the order would seem simply to have been there all along, as natural and effortless as the sunrise itself. It's a curious kind of magic trick, when you think of it. The whole art of good service in that age was to make labor invisible, to make the enormous effort of running a great house vanish so completely that the family need never see the strings, never glimpse the machinery, never once be reminded that their comfort was made by human hands at human cost. The best servant was the one you never noticed, the one whose work simply appeared, done, as if by itself. We have gone the other way entirely. We who do our own fires and carry our own water, or rather have machines do it for us. But something of that old dream lingers still, the dream of a world that arranges itself smoothly around us, of comfort that simply appears. We have only changed who or what does the vanishing. Now come down again, all the way down, to the warmest and busiest room in the whole house at this hour, the kitchen, and let's watch the making of that great breakfast we admired upon the sideboard. Because a spread like that did not simply happen either. At the heart of the kitchen stands the cook, and she is a formidable figure, up early like all the rest, her sleeves rolled, her face already shining with the heat of the range. That range is the roaring heart of the whole lower house, a great mass of black iron with its fire box and its ovens and its hot plates, burning coal from before dawn until late at night, radiating a fierce heat that made the kitchen warm, even in the deepest winter and unbearable in the summer. Everything flowed from that range. Every pot of tea, every can of hot water, every dish of eggs and kidneys and grilled kippers, all of it was cooked upon or within that single hungry iron beast, fed all day long with fresh coal. Watch the cook at her work. The eggs to be boiled and fried and coddled, the bacon and sausages to be laid sizzling in the pan, the good smell of them filling the whole basement, the kidneys to be cooked in their sauce, the kippers to be grilled, the bread to be cut, the toast to be made at the fire, rack after rack of it, the tea to be brewed strong, the coffee ground and set to boil, the whole spread to be readied and kept hot and sent up, dish by covered dish, by the footman or the maid, to arrive on the sideboard upstairs exactly when the family came down. It was a performance of timing and heat and skill, repeated every single morning, and the reward for doing it perfectly was simply that no one upstairs ever thought about it at all. But where did all that food come from? The eggs and the milk and the bread and the fish? Not from a great cold cabinet humming in the corner, for there was no such thing, only a cool larder, and perhaps a little ice, precious and expensive, kept in an insulated box. Food that could not be kept had to be bought fresh, again and again, and so the morning of the house was punctuated by a whole procession of arrivals at the area door, the tradesmen and the sellers bringing the day's provisions. Listen for them. The milkman, arriving with his churns, ladling out fresh milk by the measure into the household's own jugs, for the milk came unpackaged and had to be used quickly before it turned in the warm kitchen. The baker, or the baker's boy, with the fresh loaves. The fishmonger's boy with the morning's catch. The greengrocer's cart with the vegetables. And through the streets, at their own hours, the wandering criers of the age, each with his own particular sing-song call, the muffin man with his tray and his bell, the seller of watercress, the sharpener of knives, a whole loose, living system of small trades and daily deliveries, bringing the fresh food of the countryside and the coast into the heart of the stone city, kitchen by kitchen, door by door, every single morning. The cook or the housekeeper met each of them, chose and haggled and paid, and slowly the day's meals were assembled from all these small arrivals. It was food shopping, in a sense, but food shopping that came to you at the kitchen door in a steady stream, because the food itself would not keep, and the day's cooking could not wait. There is something almost enviable in that, isn't there, for all its labor. The fresh milk still warm, the bread still steaming, the fish landed that very dawn, all of it arriving at the door by hand, by voice, by the turning of a small, honest trade. And there is something we have lost in gaining our cold cabinets and our long-lasting packages, some small daily human contact, some closeness to where our food actually came from. We have gained enormous convenience. We have perhaps lost a little of the morning's music, the calls in the street, the knock at the door, the whole waking chorus of a city feeding itself by hand. Now let's step out of the house again, but this time let's go around the back, down a small side lane, to a place the gentleman himself rarely visited, but that made his whole way of life possible. The mews, the stables. Because if there was one creature that ruled the Victorian city as surely as any lord, it was the horse. Behind the grand houses, tucked away out of sight down cobbled back lanes, stood the stables, and here lived the horses that pulled the family's carriage, and here worked the men who cared for them, the coachman and the groom. And their morning had begun as early as any, for horses must be tended long before they can be driven. Come into the warm, dim stable and breathe it in, that particular smell that anyone who has ever known horses will recognize at once, the mingled scent of hay and leather and warm animal and manure, strong and earthy and not unpleasant, the smell of the very engine of the age. Watch the groom at his work in the lamplight, the horses to be fed their morning ration of oats and hay, the stalls to be mucked out, the soiled straw forked away, fresh straw laid down, the horses to be groomed, brushed, and curried until their coats gleamed, their manes and tails combed, their hooves picked clean and checked. And the harness, all that intricate leather work of straps and buckles, to be cleaned and oiled and polished until it shone, and the carriage itself to be washed and readied, its lamps trimmed, its wheels checked, so that whenever the family called for it, the whole equipage could be brought round to the front door, gleaming and ready in a matter of minutes. A gentleman's carriage was a proud possession, a visible sign of his standing, and keeping it and its horses in perfect order was a full day's work in itself for the men of the mews. And multiply that by the whole vast city, for this is the astonishing thing, everything moved by horse. Every carriage, every cab, every omnibus, every cart of coal and beer and bricks and vegetables, every delivery of every kind, all of it drawn by horses, tens upon tens of thousands of them, laboring through the streets from dawn to dark. The whole city ran on horsepower in the most literal possible sense, and it shaped everything, the pace of movement, the sounds of the street, the very rhythm of life, and it left its mark everywhere, for all those thousands of horses, laboring all day through the streets, left behind them a truly enormous quantity of manure and worse, so that the streets themselves were often filthy with it, which is precisely why our ragged crossing sweeper had his trade, and precisely why a gentleman's boots needed such constant cleaning, and precisely why fine ladies wore their skirts a careful length above the ground. The horse gave the city its power and its speed and its grandeur, and the horse also gave the city its filth, and the two came inseparably together, as the good and the hard of any age so often do. It's strange to think that the entire teeming life of that great city, all its trade and travel and industry, rested finally on the patient bodies of animals, on hay and oats, and the strength of a horse's back. We have replaced them all with engines now, and the streets are cleaner for it, and quieter of hooves, though louder of motors, and the great warm, smelly world of the mews has all but vanished. But for the Victorian, the horse was as ordinary and as essential as the road itself, and a morning like this one, with its carriages and its deliveries and its cabs, was in truth a morning entirely built upon the horse. Let's return to the gentleman himself for a moment, or rather to his pockets, because there is a small and homely subject there worth turning over. Money. What did a man like Mr. Ashcombe actually carry? And what did the coins of his world feel like? And what could they buy? The money of his age had a weight and a solidity to it that ours has largely lost. He might carry, tucked into a small purse or loose in a waistcoat pocket, real gold, a sovereign or two, a small heavy golden coin worth £1, warm and dense in the hand, worth a great deal indeed, and silver, the shillings and their fractions, and copper, the pennies and halfpennies and farthings, big heavy coins, dark and worn smooth by 1,000 hands. The whole system of it was intricate, and would seem strange to you. 12 pennies making a shilling and 20 shillings making £1, so that reckoning up a sum took a certain practiced mental arithmetic that every child learned young. But the coins themselves were solid, tangible things, and to pay for something was to feel the real metal leave your hand, a very different sensation from the weightless tap of our own age. And what could those coins buy on a morning like this? The newspaper he read cost him only a penny or two, a ride across town in a hansom cab, a shilling or so depending on the distance, a good chop or a plate at his club, a few shillings. And set against that, remember, the servant who cleaned his boots earned but a few pounds in a whole year. That was the arithmetic of the age, the vast gulf between what the comfortable spent without thinking and what the laboring earned by the year, all of it measured out in the same solid coins. When a gentleman flipped a copper penny to the crossing sweeper for keeping his boots clean across the muddy street, that single small coin, nothing to him, was a real prize to the ragged boy who caught it. The same money meant two entirely different things in the two different worlds, and it passed between them, now and then, in small coins tossed across the gap. Now here is a small pleasure of the gentleman's world that we haven't yet touched, one that ran through his day like a thread of blue smoke. Tobacco. For this was an age in which a great many men smoked, and smoked with a certain ceremony, and the pleasures of tobacco had their own rituals and their own particular places. There was the cigar, savored after a good dinner, or the pipe, packed and lit and drawn on slowly by the fire. And in the finer houses there was even a special room for it, the smoking room, set aside so that the smoke and the smell would not cling to the rest of the house or offend the ladies, and a gentleman might even keep a special jacket for it, a smoking jacket of rich, soft fabric, and a small cap to match, worn to protect his hair and clothes from the scent of the tobacco, so that he could indulge and then emerge fresh and unsmelling to rejoin the family. There was snuff, too, still taken by some of the older men, powdered tobacco sniffed from a small ornamental box with a practiced pinch of the fingers. And around all of it there was a certain masculine ceremony, the offering and accepting, the cutting and lighting, the retiring to the smoking room after dinner, the whole quiet fellowship of men and tobacco and firelight and low conversation. It was one of the small, deep comforts of a comfortable man's life, and like so much of that life, it had its own rules and its own furniture and its own proper place, everything in the age having, it seems, its own proper place. And now let us stand back and look at this whole morning through one last window, the window of the seasons, because the morning we have watched was a morning of one particular time of year, and the turning of the year changed everything about it. The morning we followed was a cool one, a foggy one, the kind of morning that belongs to autumn or winter or the damp edges of spring in that gray northern land. And in the cold months, the whole ritual bent itself around the cold. The fires mattered more than anything, and the servants' first labor of building them was more urgent still, for the house by morning in deep winter was genuinely bitingly cold. The water in the ewer sometimes skimmed with ice, the breath showing in the air of the unheated bedroom. The warm nightcap and the flannel nightshirt were not quaint, but necessary. The cold morning bath, in the dead of winter, became an act of real courage or real folly, depending on your view. The heavy wool clothing, layer upon layer, was armor against a chill that reached into every room. And the light was precious, for the sun rose late and set early, and much of the winter morning was spent in gaslight and firelight, the darkness pressing at the windows well past the breakfast hour. But come to the same house in high summer, and the whole morning wore a different face. The sun rose early and flooded the rooms with real daylight, and the fires in the bedrooms might be laid but not lit, or not laid at all. The heavy wool gave way to lighter cloth, the flannel nightshirt to something cooler, and the great range in the kitchen, so welcome in winter, turned the whole basement into an oven that the cook endured with sweat on her brow. The cold morning bath became, in summer, actually refreshing rather than heroic. The windows were thrown open to catch what breeze there was, and the whole household breathed a little easier, its great labor of warmth set aside for a few short months, before the cold came round again, as it always did, and the fires were relit, and the whole cycle began once more. There is something in that, the turning of the year through a single house, the same rituals bending and shifting with the seasons, that feels very deep and very old. We have flattened the seasons now, warming our winters and cooling our summers until, indoors at least, one month feels much like another. But they lived closer to the year's great wheel, closer to the cold and the heat and the early dark and the late light, their whole daily life rising and falling with it. There was a hardness in that, certainly, the cold that we have banished, the discomfort we have smoothed away. But there was also, perhaps, a closeness to the natural world, a sense of belonging to the turning year that we in our even and unchanging rooms have quietly given up. It is one more of the age's many bargains, the many things it lost and gained at once, and that we in turn have gained and lost in reverse. There is one figure in all of this whom we have followed since the very first knock upon the bedroom door, and yet whom we have never truly stopped to consider. Perkins, the valet, the quiet man with the brass can and the steady razor hand. Let's give him a little of our attention now, because his was one of the most curious and intimate roles in the whole ordered world of the house, and understanding it tells us something about the strange closeness that could exist across the great divide of class. The valet stood in an odd and rather privileged position among the servants. He was a personal servant, attached not to the house, but to the man, and that gave him a certain standing below stairs, near the top of the male hierarchy, close to the butler in dignity. He did not do rough work. His hands stayed clean. He dressed neatly, almost like a gentleman himself, in dark and sober clothes, for he had to be presentable at close quarters to his master at all hours. And he knew things about that master that no one else on earth knew, not even, in some ways, the wife. He knew the exact state of his linen and his health, the small vanities and the small failings, the way he liked his collar, and the way his temper ran in the morning. He saw the gentleman at his least guarded, sleepy and unshaven and undressed, and he kept, always, a perfect discretion about it. That discretion was the very heart of the trade. A good valet saw everything and said nothing, and this silent, knowing intimacy between two men separated by the whole width of the social world and yet joined together in the small private ceremonies of the morning was one of the strangest and most human relationships the age produced. And his craft was real, a true skill, far more than we might guess. The care of a gentleman's clothes was a demanding art. Every garment had to be kept in flawless order, and clothes in that age were expensive and were meant to last. So they were tended like treasures. Watch what Perkins does in the quiet hours after his master has gone out. He takes the coat that was worn yesterday and brushes it thoroughly, working with the grain of the cloth, lifting away every speck of dust and soot and every stray hair, for the smoky city settled its grime on everything, and a coat had to be brushed daily to stay clean. Where the cloth is marked, he sponges it carefully with the right preparation, for one did not simply wash a fine wool coat. One cleaned it by hand, spot by spot, with knowledge and patience. He presses out the creases with a heated iron and a damp cloth, coaxing the garment back to its proper crisp shape. He checks every button and every seam, and where a stitch has gone, he mends it, or sends it to be mended, before it can become a hole. He cares for the boots with the same devotion, and here was a small craft all its own. Into each pair, when they were not worn, he slipped wooden boot trees, shaped forms that kept the leather from wrinkling and losing its shape. He cleaned them of the day's mud, and then blacked and polished them through long, patient labor, layer upon layer, buffing until the leather gleamed like dark glass, for a gentleman's boots were watched and judged as closely as his face. He kept the linen sorted and counted, the collars and cuffs sent to the wash and returned and stored. He laid out each day's clothes chosen for the day's occasions, knowing without being told what was correct for the morning and what for the evening, for the club and for the church and for the dinner. All of it, the whole immaculate turned-out perfection of the gentleman, was in truth the daily handiwork of this one quiet, skilled man, working mostly unseen, taking his pride, as good craftsmen do, in a thing done perfectly and never remarked upon. It's a thing worth sitting with, that pride. For Perkins, whatever the smallness of his wage and the narrowness of his life, was a master of his craft, and he knew it, and there was a real dignity in it. To make another man look flawless, day after day, to know exactly how it was done, and to do it better than anyone, was a genuine skill and a genuine art, even if the world above stairs never once thought to call it so. There is a lesson in that, perhaps, about all the invisible crafts that hold the comfortable world together. Then and now, the skilled, unseen labor that we walk through every day without a glance, taking its results for granted as though they simply grew that way. Every polished thing in every comfortable life is somebody's quiet craft. Now, since Perkins has just finished laying out and arranging his master's things, let's look more closely at the small objects a gentleman carried upon his person as he stepped out into the day. For each one is a little world, and together they tell you almost everything about the man and his age. We have already met the watch, that beautiful heavy disk of gold, wound and settled into the waistcoat pocket, the time carried against the heart. But it did not travel alone. In another pocket rode the card case, a small flat case, often of silver or fine leather, holding a neat stack of those calling cards we spoke of, ready to be presented or left wherever the day's business or society required, for a gentleman was never without them any more than a man today is without his phone. There was the handkerchief, a square of fine white linen, spotless and pressed, often lightly scented, tucked away for use and for the small courtesies of the day. There was, very likely, a small penknife, a proper folding knife, used for a dozen small tasks, for trimming a pen or opening a letter or cutting the pages of a new book, for books in that age often came with their pages still joined at the edges to be slit open by the reader as he went. There were keys, perhaps, and a small notebook and pencil for jotting an appointment or a thought or a figure, and of course the coins we have already turned over in the hand, the gold and silver and copper of his world. And upon his finger, quite possibly, a signet ring, a ring set with a flat stone or metal face engraved with his initials or his family's mark, which could be pressed into hot wax to seal a letter, so that his very hand carried the means of stamping his identity upon his correspondence. Each of these things was solid, made to last, often beautiful, often personal, and a man knew the weight and feel of each of them in his pockets as intimately as he knew his own hands. There is a great difference, isn't there, between a life furnished with a few solid, lasting, personal objects, each one known and valued, and our own life of countless light and disposable things. He carried less, and knew each thing better. Whether that is a richer way to live, I leave for you to decide, drifting there in the dark. And speaking of scent, for we have brushed past it more than once this morning, let's pause on it properly, because a gentleman's finishing touches went beyond the mere removal of dirt. Upon his dressing table stood a small array of bottles and pots and implements, the tools of his personal grooming. There was cologne, or scented water, a splash of which cooled and freshened the skin and left a faint, clean fragrance, for a gentleman was expected to be not merely clean, but pleasant, in an age when the streets and often the people themselves were not always so. There were the fine brushes for the hair, backed with silver or ivory, often a matched set. There were small tools for the care of the nails. For a gentleman's hands, soft and pale, as we have said, were also expected to be neat, the nails clean and trimmed and cared for. There was, perhaps, a little pot of pomade for the mustache, and the wax to set its curl. All of these small acts, the splash of cologne, the tending of the nails, the setting of the mustache, added up to a man carefully composed from head to foot, presented to the world as a finished and deliberate thing, nothing left to chance, nothing untended. It speaks of a certain seriousness about the self as something to be made and maintained, a project of daily care. We are perhaps not so different, with our own bathroom shelves crowded with bottles and our own small daily rituals of grooming. The human wish to present oneself well, to be clean and pleasant and composed before facing the world, is very old and runs very deep, and the Victorian gentleman at his dressing table, dabbing on his cologne and tending his nails, was answering the same quiet vanity that we answer every morning still. But let's leave the gentlemen's rooms now and climb higher in the house than we have yet gone, up past the family bedrooms, up to the very top floors, because there is a whole other morning happening up there, quite separate from the one we have followed, the morning of the children. For the children of a comfortable Victorian family did not, as a rule, share the daily life of their parents in the close and constant way that children and parents often do now. They lived instead in their own small kingdom at the top of the house, the nursery, a suite of rooms set apart, ruled not by the mother and father but by the nurse or nanny, and later the governess. Here the youngest children ate and slept and played and were bathed and dressed, tended through nearly all their waking hours by these hired women, seeing their own mother and father, in some households, only for a short arranged visit each day. Come into the nursery, then, in the morning. It is a plainer place than the grand rooms below, though warm and safe enough, with a fire in the grate, tended like all the others, and a rocking horse perhaps, and a shelf of toys and a few books. The nurse has the children up and washed and dressed, and their breakfast is a plainer affair than the great spread downstairs, for children were fed simply on porridge and bread and milk and such wholesome plain things. The rich dishes of the adult table thought unsuitable for young stomachs. There is a strict order to their day, hours for lessons, and hours for a walk in the park with the nurse, and hours for play, all of it governed by the firm, kind rule of the women who raised them. And the lessons themselves, for the older children, were the province of the governess, a figure who occupied one of the loneliest and most peculiar positions in the whole household. She was educated, genteel, often from a good family fallen on hard times, and she taught the children their reading and writing and figures, their French, and their music and their manners. And yet she was not family, and she was not quite a servant either, and so she belonged fully to neither world, taking her meals often alone, respected by no one entirely, caught forever in the narrow space between the drawing-room and the servants' hall. Hers was a hard and solitary lot, and many a real woman lived out long years in exactly that in-between place, neither above stairs nor below, teaching other people's children in other people's houses. The visit to the parents, when it came, was a formal and rather brief and precious thing. The children, washed and brushed and on their best behavior, might be brought down to the drawing-room for a short while to see their mother, and perhaps their father before he left or when he returned. A gentle, formal interlude. And then they were taken back up to their own world at the top of the house. It sounds strange to us, even a little cold, this raising of children at arm's length, this whole floor of separation between parent and child, and yet we should be slow to judge it too harshly, for it was simply the way of that world and that class, and there was real love in it all the same, love expressed differently than we express it, through provision and duty, and the careful arranging of a safe and orderly childhood, rather than through the constant closeness we now prize. Every age loves its children in its own language, and theirs was simply a more formal tongue than ours. There is one more parallel morning we haven't yet witnessed, and fairness demands at least a glimpse of it, though gentlemen are our subject. The mistress of the house had her own morning ritual, and if the gentleman's was elaborate, hers was more elaborate still. She too was tended by a personal servant, her lady's maid, the female counterpart to the valet, skilled in hair and dress and all the arts of a lady's appearance. And a lady's dressing was, if anything, a longer and more complicated affair than a gentleman's, for her clothing was more intricate by far, and it too very often could not be managed alone. There was, at the center of it, that famous and much discussed garment, the corset or stays, a stiffened undergarment laced tightly about the body to shape the figure to the demanding fashion of the age. It could not be laced properly by the wearer herself, and so the lady's maid stood behind her mistress and drew the laces tight, shaping the waist. A daily ritual that has become almost a symbol of the whole age, of its beauty and its constraint bound up together. And over that foundation came layer upon layer, the petticoats, sometimes many of them, or the great cage of the crinoline, or the later bustle that held the skirts in their fashionable shape, and then the dress itself, with its countless small fastenings down the back that no woman could reach alone. And her hair, long and never cut, was brushed and dressed and pinned into the elaborate styles of the day, a labor of many minutes and much skill, even for the lady then, and perhaps especially for her. To be dressed for the day was to be assembled by another's hands, layer by layer, into the finished and fashionable and often uncomfortable image that the world required. The whole family, in its way, was daily built by the hands of servants into the people they were expected to be. Now let's return, for a last long look, to the gentleman himself, and to the shape of the mind he carried through his ordered morning. Because a man is not only his body and his clothes and his objects, and we should not leave him without at least a glance at his inner furniture. He was, if he was a proper gentleman of his class, an educated man, and reading and the life of the mind held a real place in his world. Somewhere in the house there was very likely a library, or at least a study lined with books, and books were valued and collected and read in an age that produced some of the greatest storytellers who have ever lived, whose long, rich novels were devoured by readers of every class, often published a chapter at a time in magazines, so that the whole nation waited together, month by month, to learn what happened next, in a way not so different from how we now await the next chapter of a story we love. He read his newspaper, as we saw, with its dense columns of news from across the empire and the world. He read the great debates of the day, for this was an age fizzing with ideas and arguments about science and religion and society and the proper ordering of the world, ideas that shook the very foundations of what people had always believed, and a thoughtful gentleman could hardly help but be caught up in them, for it was a restless, questioning, changing age beneath all its order and ceremony. The certainties of the past were being tested as never before. New discoveries were unsettling old beliefs. The whole world was being remade by iron and steam and invention, faster than any generation before had ever known change, and a man who read and thought lived in the midst of that great churning, holding to the old forms, the collar and the coat and the morning prayers, even as the ground shifted beneath everyone's feet. There is something poignant in that, the careful daily ceremony carried on with such seriousness, even as the very world that gave it meaning was beginning, slowly, to pass away. But of course they could not see that, any more than we can see which of our own certainties will look quaint and vanished to those who come after us. They simply lived, as we do, in the middle of their own time, doing each morning what seemed right and proper and eternal, unaware that all of it was already, quietly, becoming history. And there is one last shadow that lay beneath all this order and comfort, one that we should acknowledge gently before we go, because it gives the whole morning its deeper meaning, and it explains a great deal about the seriousness with which they held their little rituals, their prayers, their duties. It is this: for all their comfort, for all their gold watches and warm fires and great breakfasts, these were people who lived far closer to sorrow and to death than most of us do now. Medicine could do only so much. Diseases we now shrug off could carry away a strong adult in a week, and were far crueler still to the young. Many a comfortable family, in exactly such a house as this, knew the grief of losing a child, sometimes more than one, for even wealth and warmth and good food could not always hold back the illnesses of the age. Behind the formal nursery, and the arranged visits and the whole careful world, there was very often a small remembered grave, a child who had not lived, a sorrow carried quietly beneath the order of the day. And this, I think, is part of why they held so tightly to their rituals and their faith and their sense of duty and place, when life itself was so uncertain, when sorrow could arrive without warning. There was a deep comfort in order, in the fixed and familiar shape of the day, in the morning prayers gathering the whole household under one roof and one hope, in the steady turning of the known routine. The elaborate ceremony of that morning was not mere vanity, or not only vanity. It was also, in part, a way of holding the world steady, of making a small, ordered kingdom of comfort and habit in the face of a life that could be, and often was, very hard and very brief. There is something in that we can honor, across all the distance of the years. We too, in our own uncertain lives, reach for our small, comforting routines, our familiar mornings, our fixed and steadying habits, for the same deep human reason. We too build our little kingdoms of order against the great uncertainty. In that at least, we and they are not so very different at all. So let the whole of it settle in your mind now, gathered together, the entire morning laid out from its first cold, dark beginning. The girl kneeling at the grate before dawn. The fires blooming to life in room after room. The steaming brass can carried up the stairs. The curtains drawn back on the gray light. The cold plunge and the fierce clean glow after. The open razor whispering across the throat. The stiff collar and the studs and the layer upon careful layer. The gold watch wound and settled against the heart. The whole household gathered for its morning prayers. The great breakfast steaming on the sideboard, and the ironed newspaper propped against the pot. The horses stamping in the mews, and the criers calling in the smoky street. The letters and the cards, the coins and the keys, the cologne and the polished boots. And beneath and behind all of it, the quiet, unseen labor and the quiet, unspoken sorrow that gave the whole shining surface its weight and its meaning. It was only a morning, just the first few hours of one ordinary day, in one comfortable house, long ago. And yet look how much was folded into it. A whole world, really, with all its beauty and all its hardness, all its order and all its cost, all its comfort and all its shadow, contained in the simple matter of a man rising and washing and dressing and going out into his day. Let's go back inside now. One last time, into the house we've come to know. It's quiet again. The master is gone, and the mistress is about her own mourning, and upstairs the children are at their lessons with the governess. And below, the great slow work of the day rolls on, the cleaning and the cooking and the endless carrying of coal and water. But the frantic effort of the morning is past. The fires are burning steady. The breakfast things are cleared and washed. And for a moment, in the warm kitchen, perhaps Alice sits down at the long, scrubbed table with the other servants for a snatched cup of tea and a bit of bread. A small pause in the long day, before the bells begin to ring again and call her back to her feet. The house breathes. The clock in the hall ticks on. The morning, in all its layers, the ones we saw at first and the ones we have gone back to uncover, is finally, truly complete. And now, at last, we truly can let it go. It's remarkable, isn't it, when you gather it all up and look at it whole? What seemed at first like the simplest thing in the world, a man getting up in the morning, turned out to be a slow and intricate ceremony hours long, involving cold water carried up from a basement, an open razor drawn across the throat, starched collars stiff as boards, scented oil and secret little cloths, layer upon layer of careful clothing, the gathered prayers of an entire household, a breakfast fit for a small army, and the steady invisible labor of servants who rose in the dark to make it all appear like magic. Behind every immaculate gentleman stepping out of every glossy door, there was all of that, hidden and humming, morning after morning after morning. And most of it is gone now. The hip baths and the badger brushes, the starched detachable collars and the antimacassars, the family prayers and the ironed newspapers and the valet with his steaming brass can. All swept away by the century that followed, by running hot water and safety razors and central heating and all the small, quiet miracles we hardly notice anymore. We have gained so much ease. We have lost, perhaps, a little of that slow ceremony, that sense of the morning as a thing to be carefully built, rather than simply gotten through. Neither age is wholly better than the other, I think, but there is something worth holding on to in that old, patient, unhurried way of beginning a day. The care of it, the attention, the sense that even the smallest daily acts, the winding of a watch, the fastening of a collar, the quiet words of a morning prayer were worth doing well and worth doing slowly. And on that note, I'll let you rest. The house has fallen quiet again. The gentleman has gone out into his day, and the fires are burning warm, and the long morning is over. Your own eyes may be growing heavy by now, and that is exactly as it should be. Let them close if they want to. Let the images of that faraway morning drift and blur and fade, the gaslight and the fog, the steaming brass can, the shining boots on the scrubbed front steps. Thank you for spending this quiet hour with me tonight, and for wandering all the way back into another century in the company of a stranger's voice. If it brought you a little peace, I'm truly glad. Rest now. Sleep well. And whenever you're ready for another slow walk into the past, I'll be right here, waiting in the lamplight. Good night.